buttery, fresh popcorn, which means it's movie night here on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, well, we are going to review a recent episode of Un-Apologetics YouTube video. It's episode number 119, where he interviews David Rohl. And David Rohl is going to be talking about the United Monarchy. Now, there are several reasons why I've chosen this particular video for a popcorn review. Among those is the fact that David Rohl has become, in many respects, a sort of a cult-like figure in Christian circles. His word is often taken to be gospel truth without it being subjected to proper rigor. Now, CJ Cox, the host of this show, has no credentials in archaeology or in scholarship, and that's okay because he's just the host. We're really going to focus here on David Rohl. So, David Rohl has a master's degree from University College London, which really does not entitle you to be an Egyptologist. To be an Egyptologist, you need a terminal degree in the field. It's a bit like psychology in that respect, where you can have a dozen bachelor's and a dozen master's degrees, and you still can't be called a psychologist. In Egyptology, it's very similar. You cannot be called an Egyptologist until you achieve that terminal PhD degree. So with that said, we are going to do a popcorn review of David Rohl in this interview. So sit back and enjoy the movie.
Good evening, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Not that that's the reason that you're here for today, because we got a very important episode for you here today. Joined for a second time by historian and Egyptologist, mastermind behind the new chronology, and basically the brains behind Patterns of Evidence Exodus.
And he's not really a historian.
Mr. David Rohl, and we're going to be joined
with
him
in
just a brief moment. But without further ado, we want to go ahead and jump right into this. So I am going to go ahead and invite our guest in today. Shalom, Mr. Rohl. How are you doing today?
Hi, CJ. I'm doing great. It's late evening. Oh, sorry, early evening here, late afternoon. I think it's very early in the morning where you are, isn't it?
Yes, sir. 8:30.
Oh, you poor thing. I hope it's worth it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and it is interesting, right? Because by the end of this conversation, I'll be starting my day, and you'll be getting down to the wind down of yours. So time is a funny thing.
Yep.
Now, brief reminder for the audience. Our last conversation, we had discussed actually quite a bit, everything from Joseph's sojourn all the way through Joshua's conquest. Oh. And the main focus of today is, of course, going to be the monarchy. But I wanted to just briefly, for the sake of the audience, is there any way we could go over just in a brief synopsis kind of way what it is that has gotten us to this point so far?
Okay, well, the revised chronology, or the new chronology, basically takes around 300 years out of the conventional timeline of Egyptian history. It's not exactly 300 years all the time. It varies depending on what part of Egyptian history we're looking at. But in taking out that amount of time, it lowers the dates for the Egyptian New Kingdom and Middle Kingdom by 300 years approximately, which brings it into alignment with biblical history far better than the...
Okay. Let's just stop right here, because the new chronology is really the 1,000-pound elephant in the room. Without the new chronology, everything else David Rohl says just falls to dust. He needs that new chronology to make everything else that he's going to say work. Okay? And removing that 300 years from Egyptian chronology does a lot more than just bring Egyptian chronology into alignment with biblical chronology. It makes a complete pig's breakfast of chronology in general. And my opinion of the new chronology is that it's complete rubbish. It is absolute complete rubbish. And my reasons for it calling it rubbish, I think we should, really discuss why the new chronology is so problematic. And I'm going to break this down as sort of 3 groups of evidence that as to why it's really nonsense. First of all, it does not play well with the chronologies of Mesopotamia. Okay? So, according to David Rohl, Merneptah comes to the throne sometime around 877 BC, according to the new chronology, which would date the famous Israel stela to 873 BC. In other words, contemporary with the Neo-Assyrian king Nasser-Pal II. And his dates are 844 to 859 BC. Now, no one really contests those dates for Nasser-Pal II because there's so many synchronisms for the Neo-Assyrian kings. Now, Merneptah reigned a mere 10 years. So he's dead by 867 BC, according to the new chronology. Ramses II, Merneptah's predecessor, signed a treaty with Hattusili III in Ramses' 32nd regnal year. Now, this is a marriage agreement. So this agreement is signed and celebrated in roughly 911 BC of the new chronology. Tudela IV becomes the successor to Hattusili III, and he comes to the throne around 904 BC in chronology. So yeah, I'm throwing a lot of dates, but I'm going to bring this all back together in just a moment and show you why all this stuff is important. So try to follow along here. So in effect, there are 37 years between Tudela IV, ascension to the throne, and the death of Merneptah. And all of this is according to the new chronology. So this isn't even conventional chronology. This is just according to the new chronology. Now, the problem is that Tudela IV has a synchronism with Tukulti-Ninurta I. The reference is KUB 3.74. And there are 21 long-reigning kings between Tukulti-Ninurta I and Ashur-Nasir-Pal II. Some of those kings reigned over 40 years. Okay? Like, for example, Ashur-Dan I reigned 46 years. Ashur-Rabi II reigned 41 years. And you've got to fit that, you've got to squeeze that all into that 32nd internecine reign between Tudela IV and the death of Merneptah. It's not happening. Now, Rohl tries to get around this by stating that Tukulti-Ninurta was really Tukulti-Ninurta II. However, Rohl does this by folding hundreds of years of Mesopotamian history upon itself, essentially saying that they're all parallel reigns. Okay, and some people are going to buy this. But he never attempts to reconcile the synchronisms he's destroyed in the process. According to Rohl, Hattusili III never had a synchronism with Adad-Nirari I, KBO 1.20, who lived 20 years before Tukulti-Ninurta I. Also, according to Rohl, Hattusili III never had a synchronism with Kadashman-Enlil III, KBO 110, KBO 129, KBO 943, and KUB 372, who lived Kadashman-Enlil II lived before Kashtilash IV, who went to war with Adad-Nirari I. And the reference here is Glasner 2004, page 109. So the fact is that the synchronisms of Hattusili III demonstrate that the Tukulti, the Ninurta being referenced in the synchronism with Tukulti IV is Tukulti Ninurta I, because otherwise the synchronisms with Hattusili III make no sense. You see, Rohl is playing a vicious game here. He gaslights you by pretending that the data he doesn't like doesn't exist. And I've seen him do this in person. Synchronisms? What synchronisms? I don't know anything about synchronisms. You must be confused. And he gets away with this because those who follow him give him the benefit of the doubt because he tells you what you want to hear. And then cranks on the guilt when you begin to question him. You know, he comes off like a nice, grandfatherly English gentleman. Okay? But you can see that how manipulative it becomes as soon as you start to question him. But that's not the only reason why I think the new chronology is rubbish. According to Rohl, Ramses II lived between 943 and 877 BC for a new chronology. And Shoshank I lived between 885 and 863 BC of the new chronology. So the reigns overlap. Ramses II and Shoshank I lived at the same time under the new chronology. Okay. Shoshank I ruled from Tanis. Ramses II ruled from Ramses. Both cities are a spitting distance from each other. Are you seriously telling me that two powerful kings who could mount campaigns into the Levant somehow lived at peace as neighbors with each other? Now, that seems pretty unlikely. Which of these kings' viziers ruled Egypt? Shoshank's the viziers that ruled Egypt, or was it Ramses? Whose bureaucrats were in charge of Egypt? Each court had hundreds of bureaucrats spread out all over Egypt. Are you telling me that the bureaucrats coexisted peacefully? You know, they cooperated in the bureaucracy. Which king controlled Thebes and Memphis? Are you seriously telling me that Ramses II built the great hypostyle hall at Karnak Temple and then time-shared the Bubastite portal so that Shoshank I could put up his own inscription there? Why are the art styles between Shoshank I and Ramses II so radically different? None of this makes a whit of sense. Furthermore, computer analytics shows that the new chronology is not internally consistent. That means it contradicts itself. And there are 39 synchronisms where the new chronology is in disagreement with. That means no matter how you move the new chronology around, you cannot make a chronology that actually works. All 39 of these synchronisms are invalid with the new chronology. And those synchronisms include year 16 of Azariah with Menahem's first year, Azariah's year 16 with Shalom's year 1, Azariah's year 15 with Zechariah's year 1, Dorham's year 1 with Jehoshaphat's year 18, Azariah's year 1 with Jehoshaphat's year 17, Asa's year 38 with Omri's year 1, Humbab-Nakash the first year 1 with Nabonassar's year 5, Amurapi with Supiluluma II, Nikmadu III with Supiluma II, Amatamru II with Tudaliya IV, Amatamru II again with Tudaliya IV, a different synchronism. Nickmadu II with Mursili II. Shalmaneser II with Mursili II. Shalmaneser III with Mursili II. Now, this one's really ironic because this is a synchronism an alternative synchronism that Rohl suggested. So his own suggestions don't even work here. Tiglath-Pileser III with Nabu-Nasser. Shamshi-Adad V with Marduk-Balatsu-Ikbi. Shalmaneser III with the last year of Nadu-Apla-Adina. Nadad-Nirari II with Shamash-Mudamik. Adad-Nirari II with Shamash-Mudamik. Akhenaten with Nickmadu II. Amenhotep III with Amentamru I. Tudaliah IV with Tukulti-Ninurta I. Ashur-Bel-Kala with the last year of Marduk-Shipak-Zeri. Tiglath-Pileser III with Marduk-Nadin-Ahi. Ashur-Reshi-Ishi I with Nebuchadnezzar I. Ashur-Dan I with Zababa-Shuma-Eddin. Ninurta-Alpul-Eker with Melech-Shipak II. Enlil-Kuduri-Ursur with Adad-Shuma-Usur. Ashur-Nirari III with Adad-Shuma-Usur. Tukulti-Ninurta I with Kashtilash IV. Adad-Nirari I with Nazi-Marutash. Enlil-Nanari I with Kurgalzu II. Ushur-Abalit I with Kurgalzu II. Ushur-Abalit I with Kara-Hadash. Ashur-Ubalit I with Bernaburiash II. Shamshi-Adu I with Yamsha-Adad. Shamshi-Adu I with Hammurabi. Ishbi-Era, his first year, with the last year of Ibi-Sin. And finally, the last year of Sarl-Lagab with Shar-Kali-Shari. 39 synchronisms that are off by 2 or more years, plus or minus 2 or more years. So there's not even any possibility that his chronology can be made consistent just because of, say, idiosyncrasies in calendars or errors in recording, that sort of thing. So this reveals deep systemic problems with his chronology. His chronology is internally inconsistent, it is self-contradictory, and frankly, it's impossible. And because his new chronology is impossible, everything else he's going to say, which is dependent upon this new chronology, is complete garbage. And there's no way to sugarcoat this. Everything he does is dependent upon that new chronology. If his new chronology falls, everything else falls with it. It's the linchpin of his entire revised history. So without that linchpin, the whole structure falls apart. It's got no other foundation to stand. So that's why it's really, really important to understand what the new chronology is actually saying and what the wool it tries to pull over your eyes, which is it tries to bog you in so much detail that you cannot untwist it. You cannot figure it out. It's kind of creating a way that you ignore it just by causing so much confusion. You know, in Game of Thrones, that there's this wonderful reference that that the Finger says, where he says, you know, some people see chaos as a calamity, others see it as a ladder to climb to the top. And this is what David Rohl does, is he creates so much confusion in chronology that he can end up saying whatever he wants with nobody questioning it, because no one will take the time to unravel what he has done. Well, what we have done here in this video is completely unraveled what he has done and exposed it. It exposes that his chronology has no foundation. It cannot hold together. It's self-contradictory. It contradicts itself. So with that said, let's continue on with the video and let's see what else Mr. Rohl has to say.
Conventional scheme does. As I'm sure you're aware and your audience is aware, there are many, many scholars who believe that the biblical stories are just pious myth. simply because they can't find any archaeological evidence for the Israelites, either in Egypt or, in fact, in the Holy Land.
And there's several scholars in the biblical maximalist camp that also believe that it's not myth. So, it's not just, David Rohl here is just basically saying, there's two alternatives. This is a false dichotomy. This is the false, well, you either believe what the liberals and the mythicists and the skeptical scholars say, or you believe the new chronology. It's not that simple. There's other alternatives. And I think it's disingenuous that he only that the only alternative that's being presented here is, well, the new chronology. Because frankly, it's not even the most likely alternative.
And for most of the time, until you get down to the reign of Ahab. So by revising the Egyptian timeline, which dictates the chronologies of most of the ancient world, because most of our evidence comes from Egypt for dating.
That's wrong. Most of our evidence for dating does not come from Egypt. It comes from Mesopotamia. Okay? When you look at the 150 synchronisms that govern the chronology of the ancient Near East, and there's actually more than that, there's probably closer to 2. But let's just say 150, because that's the number I've actually cataloged. I know there's more. But at minimum, 150 synchronisms that govern ancient Near Eastern chronology. The vast majority of them are either within Mesopotamia or linked to Mesopotamia. So this here is he's presenting something false to create a straw man that can be just torn down. So I think he's wrong, and this is leading to something very disingenuous.
It synchronizes far better with the biblical timeline, which is independent of both the Egyptian timeline and the other timelines around.
Oh, that's wrong. That's wrong too. The whole idea that the biblical timeline is independent of the Egyptian timeline or any other timeline, that's completely that's wrong. I mean, every king's list in the ancient Near East, every timeline in the ancient Near East is interdependent. You can't just say that the Israelite timeline is independent of Egypt or independent of Assyria. It doesn't work that way. They're all interdependent with each other. You change one timeline in Egypt, that's going to affect the Hittite Empire, it's going to affect the Assyrian Empire, it's going to affect the chronology of Babylon, and it's going to affect Mari, it's going to affect Ugarit. It's a ripple out effect. You change a chronology in Israel, it's going to have the same effect. It's going to affect, if you change it radically, that's going to radically change the timeline in Assyria. Now, the difference between, say, the timeline in Assyria and the timeline in Israel is in Assyria, we got a lot more synchronisms that prevent it moving. So if you change the timeline in Israel or in Egypt, the Assyrian timeline's not going to move. It's just going to become inconsistent. So I think this is what he's spouting here is definitely not true.
The ancient world. And it lowers the archaeological phases too, because they're tied into Egyptian chronology as well. So it gives us an opportunity to relook at the whole of biblical history in relationship to archaeology and ancient Egypt. And in doing this revision of the timeline, it brings us amazing evidence for Joseph in Egypt and the Sojourn period.
Yeah, none of that evidence is any good at all. Like, for example, his whole idea that there are 12 tombs for the 12 brothers of the 12 sons of Jacob. He doesn't tell you that that's part of a complex of 30, 40 tombs. There's not just 12. And that so-called temple that so-called villa of Joseph was built on top of his brother's tombs. So this is just wishful thinking. It's confirmation bias.
Evidence for the Exodus. We don't have Moses. We can't find Moses as a name there, but we do have plenty of evidence of the circumstances around the time of the Exodus there. And of course, we have the conquest under Joshua, where we have.
Yeah, his evidence for Moses is pretty bad too. It's really all supposition.
Massive destructions of cities throughout the Holy Land, throughout the Promised Land, towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age, which is where I would place the conquest. You do not have that evidence when you look to the Late Bronze Age, the end of the Late Bronze Age, where the conventional scheme places the conquest.
Well, it depends on what your perception of the conquest is. Again, your role here is trying to say that, well, okay, early Bronze Age, you had this huge, or the Middle Bronze Age, you had this massive conquest of cities being destroyed one after the other. And, there was a lot of, say, city-state warfare happening during the Middle Bronze Age. Okay, that's he regards that as evidence. The fact is, the Bible doesn't state that huge numbers of cities were destroyed. Only select cities were singled out for destruction. And we only have 3 cities that have been marked for destruction by fire, which are Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. All the other cities are captured, and the Israelites are capturing them because they're moving into them. They're locating, they're setting up shop. They're making their home in Canaan. They're taking over people's homes. They're taking over people's vineyards. They're taking over the people's gardens. They're not destroying it. The whole idea is that they're harvesting from vineyards they never planted. They're occupying people's homes and cities that they never built. And that's because they're finding a new home in Canaan. They're not there to destroy and pillage. So I think Rohl here is perpetuating a certain myth that the conquest meant destruction of many, many cities.
And if you guys want a much, much more fleshed out version of what Mr. Rohl just gave us, we have a nearly 3-hour-long interview, and that was our part 1. This one's not going to be nearly as long, I hope you guys know. That one was actually kind of a fluke because, of course, interviews don't tend to last that long. But nonetheless, if you guys want to check that out, certainly recommend it. I'll drop a link in the live chat here in a moment. But that's
you probably need a lot of coffee to watch that 3 hours, I tell you.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of information, and there's a long time to have that information crammed in. But that is, of course, how we get
now. I'm regretting it's not whiskey.
And of course, there is a brief period of the judges that happens in between the monarchy and the Exodus. And of course, we don't want to focus too much on that because the point is the monarchy. However, we do want at least a little bit of acknowledgement of the period of the judges. So, of course, there was recently the discovery of the Yerubbaal inscription. So that would be the first thing I think a lot of people would want to ask is that jive at all with the new chronology?
The date of it is a little bit later. It is probably in an Iron Age context.
Okay. The Yerubbaal inscription dates to 1100 BC. It's not Iron Age. That's at the end of the Late Bronze Age. That is not Iron Age. But Rohl gets so confused with his new chronology that he's sort of mixing things up here. Now, for David Rohl, yeah, absolutely. 1100 BC is way too late for him. That's for him. That's he wants to draw that out to something that's earlier for him to make it consistent with his idea of an early Exodus date. Okay.
The find of the shirt, but the writing seems to be about 100 or so years earlier. So it takes us to a time period where...
Yeah, how would you know that? How would you know that the writing dates to 100 years earlier than that? That's just... Rohl is not a comparative epigrapher. He doesn't know anything about epigraphy. For him to make that statement is just silly. Okay, why don't you make a statement about politics or the Olympics? Have just as much credibility.
You would expect the judges to be if you were in the conventional chronology, but I don't think that is Jerubbaal. I don't think it's the same person. In order for it to be Jerubbaal in the new chronology, we would have to be finding it in the Middle Bronze Age, and we don't find it there. The late Middle Bronze Age, what we call MB2C, is where I'd expect to find any inscriptions mentioning the judges, but we're not likely to do so at that particular period.
And in that Middle Bronze Age, and I know it's, especially considering the Judges period is all, you know, tribal chieftains and warlords and stuff like that. It's a difficult period to find just in general. But is there any evidence that would line up the Judges period with the new chronology outside of what we have, of course, in other periods?
Well, there's lots and lots, actually. In fact, the next book that I've now written and is about to come out within the next month or so covers the Judges period, and we found a great deal of archaeological evidence for those judges. You don't have the names in there, but what was going on, the stories, the cities that were conquered in the conquest period, what happened to them after the conquest, all that is there. And we found some things that people are very famous things, like the standing stones at Gaza, the 10 standing stones that we find at the city of Gaza, pretty much built on the ruins of the destroyed Middle Bronze Age city, turn out now to be actually Israelite standing stones.
Yeah, you've got no proof for that. You can't prove that the standing stones at Gaza were Israelite. You know, that's just sterile supposition. There's no writing on them. You can't tell what they do.
Commemorating the covenant of the Israelite tribes who defeated the Canaanites west of the Jordan. And that is something that was not possible within the conventional dating scheme, of course, because it would be 300 years too early to have anything to do with the judges.
Yeah, and I recall that one in particular, too, because that was a shock to me, being a big fan of just everything from the Torah, really Exodus. I do like Genesis, but everything from Exodus all the way to Joshua is immensely interesting to me. So that was a huge discovery, I think. Now, the period of the judges that gets us really a solid transition into the monarchy period is probably the prophethood of Samuel or the priesthood of Eli. And so I want to start there and then move our way forward through Saul and then, of course, David and Solomon.
Right.
So first off, what time period roughly would we be seeing Samuel and Eli under your chronology? I know it's about 1100 BC, but what's going on in the rest of the world?
Well, archaeologically speaking, we're in that transition from what we call late Bronze 1B to late Bronze 2A. Late Bronze 2A in Egyptian terms is the Alemanna period. So we're in that transition period there just before the reign of Saul.
1100 BC is late Bronze 2. That's not even debated. Late Bronze 2. The material fabric of all the pottery that we find from the late Bronze Age has that transition from 1200 BC. In 1000 BC, you've hit the Iron Age 1. That 200 years is late Bronze 2. The idea that this is late Bronze 1 this is just silly. This is somebody who doesn't know his art.
Which happens in the Alemanna period in the new chronology. So
I should specify too that it is ceramic typology and material culture that defines these ages, not the dates. This is some of the confusion that David Rohl wants to throw out there. He wants to change the dates and thinks that the archaeological ages will change with the dates. Well, that's just not the case. The archaeological ages are fixed to material culture, changes in material culture.
So it's quite a difficult period to pin down. But what we do find is that Shiloh, the gathering center, if you like, of the tribes, where the ark was kept before it was lost at the Battle of Ebenezer to the Philistines, we actually see at the site of Shiloh a massive favisa, which is an area, a pit where offerings have been buried from the previous times. So we're in a situation where that material has been used just prior to the late Bronze 2A, and it's been buried on a clear-up operation, possibly after the ark has been lost, and then the Shiloh actually falls into to neglect essentially, and then later on in the early Iron Age, the site is cleared up and it's reused again. So perhaps what happened was that the offerings of the time of Eli, when the ark was there, were cleared away and buried in this pit during the Iron Age. So that seems to be again, fitting very nicely with the history and archaeology of the Bible.
Absolutely. And now, real quickly, just so you guys know, for about the next 3 minutes, I'm on my phone because my Wi-Fi cut out. That's why the image is gone. Nonetheless, though, moving on. So that, of course, is a pretty substantial thing, of course. The next thing I would want to ask in regards to this in particular is, do we have what would seem to be evidence of a transitionary period in Israel at this time, a transition from like warlords to at least the beginnings of a monarchy? I'm sure Saul might not be entirely united, but
yes,
start coming into play?
Yeah, well, of course, Saul, being the first king, he was actually asked for by the people. That's what his name Shaul means, asked for. So, yes, I mean, the people asked Samuel for a king, like every other nation. And that's what we see in this particular period. If we look at the Alemanna period, where we have these copious amount of documentation from Alemanna, the city of Akhenaten, the king of Egypt, and we have his archives of.
Okay, here's a perfect example where the whole artifice of Rohl's argument depends upon the new chronology. He has to date all the Amarna letters, King Akhenaten and the Amarna kings, so that they are 300 years later, to make them contemporary with the early kings of Israel. So again, without that new chronology, it all crumbles apart.
Letters that were sent from the Holy Land, from the Promised Land and Canaan down into Egypt. And we can read in detail there what was happening at that time in Canaan. And what we see is what's called a Habiru Revolt. And I believe in the new chronology, others do too, that the Habiru are the Hebrews, essentially the mercenaries under King Saul and King David, early years of King David. Of course, don't forget, David actually worked for Achish, the Philistine king of Gath. So, you know, these mercenaries, these Habiru.
Okay. The whole idea of Philistines being in the Holy Land at the time of the Amarna letters is deeply problematic. We do know that the Philistines are fully established in the Holy Land by the reign of Ramses III, and even by the time of Merneptah. And they probably had a presence in the Holy Land during the reign of Ramses II. But when you go as far back as Akhenaten, they're not established. In fact, there's some reports that in the Amarna letters, that the Philistines are just making their first forays into the Promised Land. So they're not established there. Okay, they're not established there yet. The Amarna letters make it clear that the tribes that represent the Philistine Confederacy are not in there. They're making their way in. There's a report of a raid. I think it's the Dudan, or maybe it's the Sharuhen, that try to make a raid into some of Egypt's holdings in the Holy Land at the time of the Amarna letters. So this indicates that they're not there yet. So I think it's deeply problematic for Rohl to try to say that during the time of the Amarna letters, the Philistines were there also.
Mercenaries are the same as David's Hebrews and Saul's Hebrews, hirelings, if you like. Remembering, of course, that Israelites are Hebrews, but not all Hebrews are Israelites. So, you know, the Israelites are particularly descended from Israel, from Jacob. And there are lots of other Hebrews around the place that were not descended from Jacob. So you have these mercenaries working for King Saul, and he builds up an army of these mercenaries, and he's able to throw the Philistines out of the hill country and set up a kingdom for the very first time. And that was the great success of Saul. And we find letters in the Amarna.
And yet, they throw out the Philistines, and yet Ramses III has to fight them, and so does Merneptah. That doesn't make any sense, because according to David Rohl, Merneptah is early on in the divided monarchy. Okay? So, did they deal with the Philistines or did they not? I don't think this makes much sense.
Letters to the king of Egypt from this character who is the leader of this Hebrew revolt. He's not called Saul, he's called Libiah. And that's, we think, is the actual name that Saul probably carried in life, because Saul is a traditional name. It's a heroic name. It means asked for. Now, he's not going to be called asked for at his birth. You know, he was asked for by the people to become the king. So it's a traditional name rather than his actual natural name that he was born with. So Libiah means the Lion of Yah. So that's probably very appropriate for the first warrior king of the Israelites before David.
Yeah, I've got some problems with Libiah being equated to Saul. But let's get this a little further, because the fact is, the problem's going to be the devil is in the details. He's going to lay out some details here to make his case, and we're going to look at some Amarna letters, and we're going to see if this actually matters.
Right. And so another thing that I would want to note on this is there evidence of specifically Samuel and Eli, or of this transition in a more concrete way? In other words, like, do we see something that appears to be like the passing of the torch, right? I'm Samuel, I'm giving this to Saul, or is that something that's a little bit more obscure from a historical perspective?
It's not the sort of thing that you would find in archaeology. And so the history we're dealing with is the biblical history, which is what the narratives tell us. Right. Archaeology tells us major events. For instance, Shiloh comes to an end as a cult center at the beginning of Late Bronze 2A, which is when we place Eli and Samuel. So that is exactly as...
Well, not quite. It doesn't come to an end in Late Bronze 2A. That's wrong. One of the things that we do find that Shiloh does continue into the Iron Age. Now, how long is somewhat of a dispute. But we do find a horned altar at Shiloh. Now, the problem with horned altars is all the horned altars in the Levant date to the 8th and 9th centuries or later. Okay, so you don't have horned altars in the Levant predating the 9th century. And you can find a reference to this in Richard Hess's book of Ancient Israelite Religion. Okay, so the fact is that since we do find an horned altar at Shiloh, we must then presume at least it continues at least into early Iron Age 1. So it's at least around during the reign of Saul, and probably into possibly into the early monarchical period of David and perhaps even Solomon's time. So we don't know when Shiloh exactly comes to an end. It apparently does persist a little while after the ark is taken and removed from Shiloh. So it does probably go on for a couple centuries after. But it is ultimately destroyed. But it does seem to have been destroyed during Iron Age 1.
Matching the story of the ark being lost at the Battle of Ebenezer, going into the Philistine hands, and eventually arriving back in Jerusalem in the time of King David.
Absolutely. And then with that, we go ahead and move on from them a little bit, because I know there'll be, especially with Samuel, it'd probably be easier to find Eli than Samuel, but nonetheless. Then we'd move on to...
They may well have found his house at Shiloh recently when they were excavating. They did find a large building just inside the walls of the settlement. It's not really called a settlement. I suppose it's a cult center with an enclosure wall around it made of big...
Just a note, Shiloh is right now being excavated by Associates for Biblical Research, so it's hard to take a lot of their conclusions seriously. So that's sort of a red flag for me.
Blocks of stone, field stones, and inside that there were storage rooms, and there was also, they've just found this large building, which may have been the house of Eli, which was probably quite near the gate where he died.
That's actually really cool. I didn't even know that.
It's all going on at Shiloh at the moment. Yes, the excavations there are annual now, and they've got huge teams of people working for them. And unfortunately, with the COVID, of course, they've not been able to do any excavations.
Shiloh has already been excavated once. The excavation at Shiloh is really what we call a secondary excavation, where a team had gone in surveyed it, did some digging, got what they thought they could get out of Shiloh, and then abandoned the site. ABR is basically doing a secondary excavation, where they're basically redigging the trenches, trying to find new discoveries there. And a lot of what ABR is doing there is just really as a means to support an early exodus. So there is a confirmation bias agenda going on there. So it wouldn't surprise me one bit if they start tinkering with the dating of things. So yes, while they have a huge team and they've got lots of money to do this, there is some methodological concerns with the excavation. It's
the last 18 months or so, but it's great work that's going on there, and so it's the sort of thing that's going to uncover new information very, very soon, I would think, in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and it is a little thing that hits home a little bit here, because unfortunately we were actually going to have Dr. Bryant Wood on at one point, but then the Shiloh, everything that there had to come up, and there's just no way we could get him on right now.
Yeah, well, I'd certainly ask Scott Stripling to give you a talk, because he's the main archaeologist now at the excavations there, and he knows all about the material that's being found currently.
Absolutely, and we do. And by the way, guys, we are definitely looking forward to a lot of the ones here in the future. Unfortunately, we're not going to get David Falk. I got to just let you guys know that one fell completely through. There's reasons for that, but his reasons are his own, so I'm not going to.
Yeah, surprise.
My reasons. Okay, let's talk about my reasons for not showing up on your show. My reasons are twofold, and I did explain this to him. They're not just my reasons; they're now the public's reasons. Posted why I didn't show up on your show. First reason was because you are either unwilling or unable to comprehend the arguments that I present. And you've done this in a previous show where you took my argument and presented it as a caricature. Straw-manned it. Okay. It's really difficult to have a good conversation with somebody who doesn't want to at least represent your arguments fairly as they are presented. Okay. Now, the second reason is because of your bias. You had talked about having Petrovich on there. By the way, I noticed he never came on your show, and yet you singled me out. You didn't talk about Petrovich coming on. Could that be because any criticism of Petrovich might preclude you getting other guests from ABR coming on your channel? But I noticed that what you had done was you had agreed to let, when Petrovich came on, to let David Rohl have the last word. And frankly, I didn't want for you to do to me what you were about to do to Petrovich. I didn't think that was cool, what you were going to do to Petrovich. And if you were going to do that to Petrovich, whom you were in closer agreement with, you would certainly do that to me. So I thought it was prudent not to come onto your channel. As far as David Rohl thinking that I'm afraid of him, oh no. I've debated David Rohl once. I would do it again. Because, his arguments cannot stand scrutiny. That's the truth. And I would do to him again what I did to him last time. So David Rohl here is kind of acting kind of cocky. Saying, surprise, surprise, that I wouldn't show up. Well, here is my answer to your invitation. Is a popcorn video. Enjoy.
Yeah, well, that's a common response, and I guess that'll give people a little bit of a hint as to what his reasons are. But nonetheless, so then we move on to a character like Saul, and you say we actually have record of Saul in the Amarna tablets as Labaya.
Yes.
Now, what is he doing in these Amarna tablets? What seems to be his claim to fame, if you will?
Well, there are a number of close similarities between what he writes to the Pharaoh in Egypt and what we hear in the biblical stories. For example, he claims when he writes to Pharaoh to have recovered from these Indo-European guys living down on the plain. We would call them Philistines, of course, in the Bible terms. He's recovered 2 of his towns from these so-called Philistines.
He doesn't say Philistines. And he doesn't say any of the tribes that would be associated with Philistines. You're assuming they're Philistines. They're just other Canaanites. You know, he's just recovering them from other Canaanite groups. There's no mention of the Philistines at this time in the Amarna letters taking over large numbers of towns. That's sterile conjecture.
He doesn't call them Philistines, obviously, but he calls...
No, he doesn't. Of course he doesn't call them Philistines. You call them Philistines. And that's because you're reading something into the Amarna letters that isn't there.
Them, you know, the kings of Gath and the kings down in the coastal plain, which in biblical terms will be the Philistines. And that's exactly what happened in the story when Jonathan...
The Philistines are Indo-European sojourners. They're coming from Anatolia. They're not the native inhabitants of the land any more than the Israelites coming from Egypt were native inhabitants. Okay? So to say that they were there, you have to sort of show that they were there. And you haven't done that.
His son, and he seized back the towns of Gibeah, his hometown, and of course Michmash across the other side of the Wadi. So that matches.
Takes back Gibeah, his hometown. Well, that is very, very interesting. Okay, where was Libiah's hometown? Alemanna 289 says that Libiah was the lord of Shakmu, which is Shechem, not Gibeah. It's Shechem. Okay. So in Alemanna 252, Libiah is he's a vassal of the king of Egypt, and he sends a letter of vassalage, basically saying that he's the servant of the king. And he says, I fall at the feet of the king, my lord. I will guard the men that seized the city and my gone. They are despoilers of my father, but I will guard them. Okay? So, Libiah's home city wasn't Gibeah. Libiah's home city was Shechem. And the hometown of Libiah is conquered and then retaken. Okay? So, that does not quite check out.
Another example is that he writes a letter to the Egyptian governor down in Gaza, saying that he'd been fooled by his own son, who'd been associating with the Habiru chieftain, some rebel guy, and he was not unaware of it. And he writes to the governor, the Egyptian governor down there, says, I was unaware of this, what was going on with my eldest son, and I'm really angry about it, and I'm going to send him down to you, governor, so that you can chastise him. Well, and I can actually give you the quote from the Alemanna letters. Why don't I just read it for you? This is the Alemanna letter 254. This is from Libiah to Pharaoh. And it says, moreover, the king wrote about my son. I did not know that my son was consorting with the Habiru. I herewith hand him over to Adiah, who's the Egyptian commissioner. Now compare that to 1 Samuel 20, 30, 31. You son of a rebellious slut. That's what Saul is calling Jonathan. Do I not know that you...
Let's read the whole Amarna letter. Let's go to the primary source. All right. To the king, my lord and my son, thus Libiah your servant, and the dirt on which you tread, I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, my son, 7 times and 7 times. I have obeyed the orders that the king wrote to me. Who am I that the king should lose his land on account of me? He's basically saying to the Egyptian king, hey, I'm protecting your land. I thought this was the Israelites' land. The fact is that I am a loyal servant of the king, and I am not a rebel, and I am not a delinquent in duty. I have not held back my payments of tribute. Saul's paying the king of Egypt tribute? That doesn't seem like very independent of the king of Egypt. I have not held back anything requested by my commissioner. He denounces me unjustly, but the king, my lord, does not examine my alleged act of rebellion. Moreover, my act of rebellion is this: when I entered Gaza, I kept saying, everything of mine the king takes. But where is what belongs to the Mekulu? I know the actions, the Mekulu against me. Moreover, the king wrote for my son. I did not know that my son was consorting with the Habiru. I herewith hand it over to Adaiah. Moreover, how if the king wrote for my wife? How could I not hold her back? How if the king wrote to me, put a bronze dagger into your heart and die? How could not I execute the order of the king? That's Amarna Letter 254. This does not sound like an independent king of Israel that waged war against the Philistines. This sounds like a sycophant vassal of the Egyptian king. The devil is in the details. It always is.
So why does Saul call his son the son of a slut? Because it appears that that Saul's queen has gone over to David's side and becomes one of his wives.
And of course, this is
that's sterile supposition.
Something that would be not terribly uncommon. It's probably not common practice, but it's probably not uncommon either, right? For a monarch
that royal wives were
kind of take
under
members
constant
of the
guard,
previous
I think that would be very,
monarch's
very
house.
difficult.
Yeah,
to
but
pull
this
off.
is before Saul is dead. This is happening during Saul's reign, when David is still fairly young and he's gone down into Judah, and he's actually trying to avoid being captured by Saul, who's really mad with him. Remember, he throws a spear at him. And this is the schism between the tribe of Judah eventually that comes apart, which separates the northern kingdom from the southern kingdom. There's this enmity between Judah and the other tribes.
The reason the northern kingdom and Judah
I think
separate
this is going on during the time when Saul was king and when David was his rival. And so David not only consorts with the eldest son and crown prince of King Saul, but he also seems to have taken
See, this is not even historically correct according to the Bible.
And again, just to briefly remind the audience again,
it's not historically correct.
1 Samuel 12 verse 8 does actually seemingly say as much. So, this is not something that is, of course, without precedent by any stretch.
It's pretty scandalous, and it's not something you hear a lot of commentaries discussing, but it's very likely that the name of the queen and the name of
it's conjecture.
David's wife is actually very rare. The only two times we see it in the Bible is one with Saul's queen and the second with David's second.
Commentaries all take an evidential approach. In order for someone to say something in a commentary, there has to be evidence. This isn't evidence. This is conjecture. This is a good story. But there's nothing in the biblical text that would say that this is true. This is why you don't find it in commentaries.
Is there anything that we might have from this period that would give us extra information about Saul? In other words, something we might not find from the biblical text that perhaps is new for us under the new chronology?
Sure. Well, the first thing is the territories were identical between the kingdom of Saul and the kingdom of Labiu were identical. And I'll just give you a quote from Professor Oded Tammuz, who's one of the great scholars from Ben Gurion University. He says this about it, remembering that he's working within the conventional chronology. So he's comparing Labiu from the late Bronze Age to a Saul in the Iron Age. That's what he's doing. But he says, it is quite possible that the life and times of the historical figure of Labiu, the Habiru leader from the Amarna period, formed the basis for the biblical tradition of King Saul and the successful Hebrew revolt against the Philistine oppression, which occupies most of the first book of Samuel. So in other words, he's comparing the two and saying basically the story of Saul is an invention.
Okay, just because a professor says that the story is comparable, he's not saying that the details are the same. There's a difference there. You can say that the Sargon of Akkad birth narrative is comparable to the basket narrative of Moses, but the details aren't the same. So I think Rohl here is being very, very loosey-goosey with the terminology that he's citing here, when probably the original source is a lot more circumspect about how close the narrative of Libiah is to Saul. And my guess is that what that professor is doing is basically saying that Saul is really a fiction that was taken from Libiah. Okay, not that they're the same person, but that one narrative inspired the other. So that's very, very different than saying they're the same person.
Borrowed from the time of Libiah. But what the new chronology does, he says, no, 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 no. Libiah and Saul are the same person. These two histories are connected because they are the same individual. And you get the same thing happening with Israel Finkelstein, who's the famous archaeologist from Tel Aviv University. And he makes this comment about Libiah and Saul. He says this: I see a great deal of similarity between Shechem under Libiah, this is the town in the northern part of Saul's kingdom, and his sons of the 14th century, and the Saul territorial entity of the 10th century BCE. Both expanded from the highland hubs to the Gilead, that's east of the Jordan. Both threatened cities in the Jezreel Valley. Both Saul and Libiah established a large territorial entity in the highlands. Both seem to have attempted to expand into the lowlands, and both failed to do so. Saul was the last Libiah. And that's a quote directly from Finkelstein.
Yeah, well, Finkelstein is presenting it as a mythological case. He's not saying that the details are the same. What he's saying is one story inspired the other. One is a mythological retelling of the earlier history. That's what Finkelstein's saying. He's not saying the details are the same.
One of the ones who is most pessimistic about the historical validity of the biblical text. And here he is basically saying the two kings' reigns are identical. What they did is identical. Their territories are identical. But problem is, one is in the 14th century and the other one is in the 10th century. Well, in the new chronology, it's the same time period.
Of course, because the new chronology fixes everything except for what it breaks.
Both of them are in the 10th century.
And of course, this is, just something that is quite frequent, honestly. Like we have a statue of Joseph. It's just not in the right place. We have all these Hebrews.
Yeah, again, you can't prove that that's a statue of Joseph. It could be any Hyksos dignitary. Again, all of this is sterile conjecture. It's all empty. It's fantasy.
And they're enslaved. They're just not in the right place. We have all these people disappearing. It's just not in the right place. And of course, one that's popular, especially for people in my audience, might be the Akhenaten one, because that one doesn't, a lot of times that's more versus people who take the late date. But when you take a late date, people will say, oh, well, Akhenaten obviously influences Moses. Well, if you reverse your logic there, then Moses influences Akhenaten, or potentially even David if you have a chronology. Which I believe
exactly.
probably get a little. Sorry, go ahead.
I think, without a shadow of a doubt, it's the other way around. It's Moses has influenced Akhenaten, and that's something we can get into in a little while. But yes, I mean,
that's baloney.
What we're basically saying here is that both Saul and David in his early, perhaps the first half of his reign, are contemporary with the Alemanna period and Akhenaten. So you can see the comparisons between the two religions.
Again, without the new chronology,
the worship of the light and the Akhenaten as the Arten. And it's the solar disk, but it's more the light of the solar disk. And if you read the Psalms of David, you see a lot of references to the light of God. And the Holy of Holies in the temple is lit by the rising sun, just like at Alemanna, the same sort of thing happens. So you are a very strong similarities.
So
and
same
this
with the Wadjet
idea of
too.
a solar Yahwism that we have in the monarchy period, all the way down
need Atenism for that.
to the 7th century, and then the Reformations of Josiah come in. The monarchy seems to have a lot of symbolism for Yahweh, and the sun. The comparisons are they're a very royal type of idea of theology. which is different to what the prophets and the judges were actually saying. So, kingship tends to borrow, especially even Israelite kingship tends to borrow from other kingly civilizations, and most of those are solar worshipping civilizations. So you can see the solar activities in the monarchy period in directly relationship to Yah or Yahweh until the time of Josiah, and then the reforms kick in, and we get back to Mosaic Yahwism, which is
Israelite culture boiled Egyptian symbolism all the way through its history. This isn't something just reserved for, say, the early monarchy. It happens in late monarchy. It happens before the monarchy. So this is nothing surprising and nothing unique. So their attempt to make something unique out of this is special pleading. It's, again, fallacious reasoning.
Very different to the monarchy Yahwism.
And by the way, just once again, kind of, give a little drop to the audience. You guys can actually kind of see a little bit of that in, once again, just looking in your own Bibles. And when you see that it appears, at least at first, that the Bible is anti-monarchy. When it's transitioning from Judges period into Saul's reign, it's, oh, well, the people asked for this, and the people want to be like the other nations, and the people. Only after do we start to see the monarchy spoken about in a more positive light by the time it's already established. Right. Which of course lines up exactly with what you are saying here.
Yeah, I mean, it's when we delve into these sorts of problems, you have to think about history and humanity and the way things work in ancient history, how kings behave. It's not always very attractive what happens. And you constantly see throughout the divided monarchy period, you see the prophets chastising the kings for their bad behavior, for their worship of false gods, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel. So it's not a comfortable situation between kingship and the people and the prophets.
Absolutely. Now, one thing that I think would be interesting to note, because it's going to become a much bigger deal when we move on to other kings, is Egypt. And of course, we already know that there is some back and forth in the form of the Amarna letters. Does Saul have any sort of vassalage or treaty or even potentially a marriage with the pharaohs in Egypt?
This is a very interesting question. You have to wait for one more reign before you get that. And it happens in the reign of David, not in the reign of...
We just read a vassalage letter in Alemanna 254. Okay? For him to say you have to wait until the later reign, that's... If he's trying to make the case that Leviah was Saul, then Leviah definitely has a vassalage agreement with the king of Egypt. Okay? Because we just read it here. So, yeah. But he also knows that this won't play well. Because Saul is seen as an independent figure. That's sort of a sort of a warrior king. That's how he's portrayed in the Bible. He's not portrayed as a vassal of the king of Egypt. So, he knows this isn't going to play well with his audience because it doesn't play nice with the biblical account.
Saul is essentially rebelling against the Philistine oppression. And the Philistines are actually working on behalf of Egypt in this period. So they are like acting as Egypt's representatives in Canaan. And so when the Habiru come down from the hills and start attacking these cities like Gath and killing people and killing the Philistines, which is what happens in the Amarna period, the problem is
okay. The whole idea that the Philistines were working for the kings of Egypt is just patently ridiculous. It's silly. But this is the sort of machinations you have to go through. You have to go through all these twisted, convoluted explanations when you start messing with the timeline on this basis. You're going to have to say something along the lines that, oh, the Philistines are the agents of Egypt, and that Leviah wasn't an agent of Egypt. Just to try to shoehorn the Leviah narrative into the biblical narrative. It's crazy, but he's got no choice but to do this.
Akhenaten doesn't respond because he's a weak king. He's sitting there in isolation, worshipping his god in Amarna, and he's refusing to send Egyptian troops to go and help these Philistines who are getting murdered at the gates of Egypt. I mean, he actually says that in a couple of letters, that two of the rulers of these cities are actually fleeing to Egypt, are slain at the very gates of Egypt. So this is the time.
Okay. Akhenaten is not a weak king. He is a absentee landlord. There's a difference. Okay? Akhenaten is not a weak king. He's got a very, very powerful army. Very, very powerful army. But the tribute keeps coming, and he doesn't care. As long as the tribute keeps coming, he's fine with the status quo. This is the same army. The Akhenaten's army is going to be the same army that Horemheb uses to later on fight the Hittites. Akhenaten had a very, very powerful army. In order to enforce a one-god monolatrous rule in Egypt, you need a powerful army. Because the king is not just a religious leader, he's a military leader. And we have lots of evidence from, say, Karnak to show that, early on in Akhenaten's reign, he even went on campaign. So he's not a weak leader. He's not a weak king. He's just a disinterested king. He has his own interests and his own agenda. And that agenda doesn't include getting involved with the squabbles of vassal states in the Levant.
The window of opportunity for kingship for Israel, because Saul is able to destroy the hold of the Philistines on the region, and Egypt does nothing about it. It stands back. And it's only later, when Akhenaten is dead and we get the 19th dynasty pharaohs coming in, that we start to see them establish themselves back in the land. And that, of course, is during the time of King David. So there is where we get the interesting connection. How does Egypt calm things down, and how does David become a great conqueror, and how does Solomon become the richest king in the region? Is it with the help and the ally of Egypt? Is Egypt helping? Why did Pharaoh offer his daughter to Solomon? These are all questions we can address.
Okay, why did the king of Egypt offer his daughter to Solomon? It's a good question. The answer is because at the end of Dynasty 21, the whole dynasty was falling apart with Siamon and Susanes II. And because the whole dynasty was falling apart, they needed allies. And they'd even take allies among the Israelites at that point. They weren't being picky. Because the state of affairs in Egypt had just gotten that bad. Okay, so that's why Solomon received a daughter of the king. Okay? It's not because of all of this sort of sterile conjecture. It's not because Philistines were dying at the gates of Egypt. Again, you have yet to show that these were actually Philistines being killed by Libiah. That still has not been proven, or even shown a shred of evidence to support.
Can I just mention that perhaps one of the most important links we haven't talked about between Libiah and Saul is how they both met their end. And this is very important because both of them died either on or in the proximity of Mount Gilboa, which is up in the Jezreel Valley areas to the south of the Jezreel Valley. And we actually have letters in the Alemanna Letters talking about the death of Libiah. And in fact, it's the king of Gath who is responsible for the death of Libiah, and it's the king of Gath who's responsible for the death of Saul. So there's a very close parallel there. They both die in battle fighting the king of Gath in the same area, and both have the name of the surviving son is the same. In the Bible, Saul's son is called Ishbaal, and Libiah's son, who survives him, is called Mutbaal, both of which mean man of Baal. Mut is Canaanite, Mutbaal. Ishbaal is man of Baal in Hebrew. So they not only die in the same place, being killed by the same king's army, but they also have a surviving son with the same name, who both of them flee across the Jordan to survive on the east side of the Jordan Valley.
Okay. And that is where this whole thing falls apart. Because, according to the Bible, Saul, when Saul dies in battle, all his sons die with him, except one, Ishbosheth. Let's see if he talks about this a little more.
And that, of course, is probably one of the better links, considering that I doubt that there's a lot of very popular historical figures who are dying at the exact same spot in the exact same way.
I think it's pretty difficult to imagine. And there is one other letter which is very important, which is after Libias killed. In other words, when Saul Libias died, his son, the surviving son, Mutbal Ishbal, writes to Pharaoh. And he actually mentions a whole bunch of people which turn out to be part of the book of Samuel. I'll give you the quote. This is the quote from Alemanna Letter 256. How can it be said in your presence, Mutbal has fled, Mutbal Ishbal? Somebody's complained to the Egyptian Pharaoh and he's responding to it. Claiming that he has hidden Ayab. As the king, my lord, lives, I swear Ayab is not in Pella in Transjordan. In fact, he has been in the field, i.e. on campaign, for 2 months, just as Benanima, just as Dadua, and just as Yeshua. Just go and ask them. Now, when you actually analyze those names, which are written in Canaanite, they turn out as follows. Mutbal means man of Baal, which is what Ishbal means, and Ishbal is the son of Saul. Ayab, which means Yah is the father, is Joab, which is the general of Saul's army. Yaab in Hebrew. So Ayab, Joab are the same person. Benanim is a bit of a problem. Maybe it means the son of the gods, which is Baana. We're not sure about that one. But two more are very important. Yeshua, mentioned in the letter, means Yah saves. And that is the name Jesse, Yishai in Hebrew, who's the father of David. And we even have David in there, Dadua, the beloved, who's David. So in this letter, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people mentioned in the book of Samuel, 2, 3 or 4 of which are very famous.
All right, let's read Alemanna 256. Let's see what it really says. How much of this is let's read it verbatim. So this is from Moran's translation. Say to Yanhanu, my lord, message of Mutbalu, your servant, I fall at the feet of your lord. How can it be said in your presence, Mutbalu has fled? He has hidden Ayab. How can the king of Pahilu flee from the commissioner? Pahilu is in the Transjordan. It's in the Jordan. Okay, it's near Pella. Okay? Mutbalu was ruler of Pahilu. Okay? So he's ruling in Jordan. He's not ruling in Gibeah, where Saul had his power base. That's very telling right there. Okay? Shakini of the king, his lord. As the king, my lord, lives, I swear Ayab is not in Pahilu. In fact, he has been in the field for 2 months. Just ask Ben Alima, just as Tajua, just ask Yeshua, whether he, after he of Geru, became hostile. Urdumu, Aduru, Araru, Meshta, Magdalu, Heniambi, Sarku, Hayanu, along with Yablimu, have been captured. Moreover, seeing that after you sent me a tablet, I wrote to him, before you arrive from your journey, he will surely have arrived in Pahilu, and I do obey your orders. Okay? So Mutbalu, son of Libiah, is another vassal of the Egyptian king. But he's a vassal who's living in the Transjordan. Okay? He's not living in Shechem. He's not living in Gibeah. He's living far away from there. So that raises the question of why. But there's another problem with this whole Ishbosheth, is that the biblical account, and Rohl actually repeats this, is that Ishbosheth, or Ishbaal, which is another name for Ishbosheth, was the only surviving son of Saul. Saul dies on the battlefield along with all his sons, including Jonathan. And the only surviving son is this Ishbosheth. Okay? The problem is, after the death of Labayu, Alemanna text 246 says, the two sons of Labayu have indeed given their money to the Habiru and to the Sutians to wage war against me. The two sons of Labayu. Two sons survive the death of Labayu. The Bible makes it clear that only one son survives the death of Saul. It's not the same person. Saul and Labayu have cosmetically similar biographies, but they're not the same person. Because again, the devil is in the details.
Obviously, we've already gotten some of the stuff that we have outside of the Bible for him, but just to remind the audience, what is his deal, right? Like, a lot of people probably don't even know he exists. They think it goes Saul, then David immediately.
No.
So who is this guy, Ishbaal?
Well, Ishbaal is the only son. Oh, well, actually, there are two. There's one as an invalid as well. But the only son that was at the Battle of Gilboa, who escapes.
The invalid is the grandson.
And he's taken across the Jordan by...
And he's not about to make war.
Saul's general. And he's protected there. And he actually becomes the king of Israel. David is only the king of Judah at this time. So after Saul dies,
the invalid happens to be the son of Jonathan. He's not one of Saul's sons. He's the grandson of Saul, Mephibosheth. He is the son of Jonathan that David forgets about. He's a cripple. He's a cripple. And the only son that's actually, considered to be kingly material was Ishbosheth. Okay? He's the next in line to the throne. So when we look at, say, Alemanna, 246, where it talks about the two sons are waging war, it's not talking about Ishbosheth and Mephibosheth. It's talking about two able-bodied sons who are capable of a military campaign. Okay. The thing with Ishbosheth is he's called a man of shame. That's what Ishbosheth means, man of shame. And he's a man of shame because he's a coward. He refuses to fight. That's why he wasn't at the battle with his father. He's not there. The two sons of Labayu are very, very different. They're cut out for war. Let's look at Alemanna 246. Say to the king, this is a letter from one of Akhenaten's vassals. Say to the king, my lord and my son, message of Biridia, your loyal servant, I fell at the feet of my king, my lord and my son, 7 times by 7. I have heard the message of the king, and indeed, you are, broken text, may the king, my lord, know, the two sons of Labayu have indeed given their money to the Habiru and to the Sutians in order to wage war against me. May the king take cognizance of his servant. Okay? These are the two sons of Labayu. Saul had only one surviving son, and he was a coward. What's being portrayed in the Amarna letters are two sons that continue their father's conquests. That's what we see going on in the Amarna letters. Okay? But this is not what we see in, say, the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. What we see is one son who is a coward, who hides behind his general, and a grandson that is so crippled he can't even walk properly. He needs assistance. These are not two men capable of war.
He becomes the king of Judah in Hebron for 7 years, 7.5 years, before he takes Jerusalem. And in that 7.5 years, perhaps for the first 2 years of it, we think, we're not sure, it's Ishbaal who's the king of the kingdom of Israel, as it were, because he's the successor, the surviving successor of Saul. And in fact, the two of them may well have worked together in this period to overthrow the Philistines. So it's very possible that when David turns against Achish, the king of Gath, the head of the Philistine confederacy, that he's doing that in league with
David and Ishbosheth had a civil war going on. And that's, you know, they were not working together to drive out the Philistines, because David had actually at that point joined the Philistines to run away from Saul. So he was still public enemy number one.
Ishbaal, Mutbal, across the other side of the Jordan. So that seems to be what we find in the Alemanna letters, that the two, called the two sons of Labiah, remembering that David is a son-in-law of Labiah. He married Saul's daughter, another one of his marriages. So so he's regarded as a son, and he's almost legitimate.
Oh, that is stretching a point. Wow. Cannot believe you actually made that argument that David was one of the sons-in-law and therefore a son of Saul. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, this is more than just his chronological revisionism. This is historical revisionism. This takes the Bible and it really just turns it on its head. Yeah, this is just, wow.
By the fact that Saul calls him my son when he's even chasing him in the hills of Judah during the period when they were against each other. So the two sons that survived the battle of Saul are in fact these two sons, David and Ishbaal, or Mutbal and Dadua. That's the two names in the Alemanna letters. So Ishbaal actually then is assassinated. He's killed by people who think they're doing it on David's behalf. But of course, then you get the lament of David when he finds out that these guys have killed his brother, the king up there. He writes this famous song about how the mighty fallen on the Battle of Gilboa. Yeah, so he's obviously trying to either cover up the fact that he did order the assassination of Ishbaal, or in fact he genuinely didn't know this was going to happen, and these were people trying to earn favor from him by killing the legitimate king.
Yeah, and if you guys are familiar with the old History Channel show Battles BC, they took the latter position on that basically David operated somewhat as a mob boss and wanted to kill the messenger. That way nobody could link it to him. Now, whether or not it happened, obviously it's easy to see that occur because of the fact that we know how kings worked. We know David was quite the warlord in his early days. So certainly possible, but also certainly possible, of course, that it could be something else. We know that, for example, Julius Caesar didn't want the death of his enemy, whose name is fleeting. I think it was Cassius.
Or Pompey.
No, Pompey.
Pompeius. Yeah, Pompeius. It's an old thing with dynasty squabbles, isn't it? You have the Judaic dynasty and you have the Saulite dynasty from Gibeah, and Saul's line is completely eliminated, and the town Gibeah is virtually wiped out by David. All the people there are either taken away or slaughtered. So he's making sure that his line, his dynastic line, succeeds beyond his reign. That was the whole point. And that is the kingdom of David. It goes on and on and on. And even when the schism takes place, you still have the Davidic line in Judah, in the southern kingdom. And in Israel, of course, we have the northern kingdom, which is actually against the southern kingdom on many parts of the time period. So, yes, David, as we said before, was a flawed character, and he wasn't beyond getting rid of somebody who was standing in his way.
Yeah, and one thing that I would want to ask briefly, just because, and this will probably be the last question as far as Ishbaal is concerned, just because I think it's interesting. The Bible doesn't explicitly note this as a link, but from a historian's perspective, we could potentially see. Is there any carryover that we can see from this time that they were split that potentially leads them to split again? In other words, like, you see the South and the North here in America, they split at one point, and even to this day, you could see the sentiment that could have them split again.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and do we see that kind of thing happening?
Yeah, well, it's there in the writings of the Bible. If you know your Bible, you'll know that Ishbaal is called Ishbosheth by the Judaic scribes, the ones who are reporting on this history. Kings and Chronicles. They are writing from a Davidic perspective, not from a Saulite perspective. And Ishbosheth means man of shame. How dare he have a name called the man of Baal? That's not allowed in Judaic Yahwism. So he's given this name man of shame, but we know he's
given that name because he's a coward.
Really called Ishbaal. So yes, this resentment continued all the way through until the death of Solomon, and then you have the breakup, what we call the schism, where the kings of the king Jeroboam I is proclaimed king in the northern kingdoms with most of the tribes backing him, and on the south we have Rehoboam, and he's only backed by 2 tribes. So he's actually the weaker one in this situation. He's the son, the genuine son, the legitimate son of Solomon. But he is not accepted by the rest of the tribes. They prefer to have Jeroboam ruling them.
Yeah,
and that's because Rehoboam takes the whip to the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes come up to the 10 tribes come up to Rehoboam and say the taxation by Solomon was really, really harsh. And Rehoboam consults his young friends, and the old courtiers say, hey, you know what, you might want to ease up on the taxation a bit. And the young guys say, well, stick it to him. And he listens to his young friends. And Rehoboam goes, yeah, you think I'm going, my father was tough, I'm going to be worse. I'm going to be really a tyrant, and I'm going to crack the whip, and I'm going to tax you hard. And the 10 tribes say, nuts to this. We don't need you as a king. And that's where the divide happens. It doesn't happen because of this earlier division between, say, Saul and the line of Saul and the line of David. It's the whole event occurs over taxation, essentially. The 10 tribes were no longer willing to pay for the extravagancies of the king.
I think it's just definitely very fascinating to think, from a historian's perspective, that we can see that begin even before David is reigning, right? With Ishbaal taking the reign, and then David taking the reign of Judah, and them being separate kingdoms. It's just a fascinating thing.
And don't let's forget the revolt against David in his reign by his own son.
Right.
So, you have it going on all the time. David was a mighty conqueror, but he had to hold that kingdom together, and he had to fight to hold it together most of his reign.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's and it is interesting, of course, right? That is one of those things where at the time, David might not have been quite as beloved as he is now, right? He's thought of now as this great foundational king, and potentially he was by a lot of his followers at the time. But, we can see with Absalom, with Ishbaal, with Saul, that it wasn't quite that cut and dry. There was quite a bit of people who were not in the Davidic camp.
Absolutely. But don't forget that the New Testament then follows on from the line of David. So, the Messiah, Jesus, was descended, whatever the genealogy links are, to David himself, King David. That was the legitimacy that we have in the New Testament. It goes back to David. It doesn't go back to...
It is important to note here that David Rohl is an agnostic. He doesn't actually believe in the existence of God. He's more or less playing to a Christian audience, and he's a very good actor. Okay. He's been on the record many times saying he's an agnostic, so he doesn't actually believe that Jesus is the Messiah that died for the sins of the world. He's just playing to his audience.
Saul. It doesn't go back to Jeroboam. It doesn't go back to anybody else. It goes back to David.
Which gets us a pretty solid transition to David, actually. That's, of course, one of the bigger kings that we want to talk about here today. Now, first off, just to remind the audience, you said we do actually have what could certainly be a reference to David in the Amarna letters, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a difficult one because the name is Dadwa, okay? And David's name is probably Dawid or Duda. So it's very possible. They both mean the beloved. Some people would argue that it's Tadua, not Dadua, but this is a question of Akkadian phonetics and Hittite inscriptions, because we...
Yeah, in Akkadian, T's and D's are interchangeable, and so you can never be sure in Akkadian. So ta and da are similar phonemes in Akkadian, so, you know, you can't just look at the text and say it's one or the other.
Now, in the early days, we had kings called Dudalias in the lands of the Hittites, and then he's now become Tudalias, and we have Taduhipa and Daduhipa. So that element, da or ta, is debatable as to which it should be. But whichever it is, they both mean the beloved. And that was the name. That's what David means. So the names are the same. One is basically Hurrian, because David had a lot of Hurrian mercenaries working for him. So they would have called him David, you know, Dadwa, or whatever it was. And then you have the Semitic version, Dawid, coming from that. So it's very likely that it's almost, you know, it's an epithet that's given to him by his Hurrian forces.
And then that would, of course, get us the opportunity to start asking some of the real questions here. So first off, I would like to ask about the links between David and Egypt, because, of course, that's going to be where we get the big archaeological evidence outside of the Bible and historical evidence outside of the Bible. And I think that's probably a good way to understand what exactly the government of the United Monarchy looked like and what they were doing. So what are David's links with Egypt at this time?
Okay, well, if we try to think of the timeline, and that's quite complicated to do now, I think we need to try and look at that in more detail. Let me see if I can find a slide here. And it may be worth trying to share. I don't know if we can share the screen here. That might help people to see. If I can only find the thing, just hold on a minute while I try and look for it. But it's very important to work out exactly whose reign starts when, and
yeah, you need that new chronology, otherwise none of this works.
And how they overlap with each other, how the 90th dynasty overlaps with the United Monarchy period in Egypt. And it's probably best if I can visualize that for you, but I'm just trying to find, or maybe this one will do it. Let me share this screen with you. Let's see if we can do this properly. It's always a bit complicated. If I click on share screen, yeah?
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay. So you should have a purple screen now with the title, The Early 19th Dynasty Chronology. Is that what you've got?
Absolutely.
Because I can't see you now. So, right, I'm going to just put up some dates for you now. King Horemheb, who is pretty much the last king of the 18th dynasty. This is after Akhenaten's died. He reigned for 13 years. We now know that because in his tomb we found lots and lots of wine jars with a year 13 on them. So it looks like the wine was placed in the tomb at the time he died.
We actually find wine dockets for several years in Horemheb's tomb, because wine was placed in there every year. Okay, and the final date we have is the 14th year. Okay, so the reign of Horemheb is probably more closer to 14 or 15 years, because his death apparently occurs after the wine harvest.
But unfortunately, Manetho, who's the Egyptian historian who wrote down the king's list and all the different dates of Egyptian kings, he only gives him 4 years, 1 month. So that was a bit weird. People look at that and think, well, that can't be right. There's something obviously wrong with Manetho. He's made a mistake somewhere, but he hasn't actually. And the reason for that is very clear, because Seti I, who actually is not included in Manetho at all, he reigned for 11 years, and he was like the second king of the 19th dynasty. His father, Ramesses I, only reigned for 1 year and a bit. So he's the father of Ramesses II. So these guys are the ones who are contemporary in Egypt with David in Israel. So Ramesses II also claimed that he was crowned.
Wait, that makes no sense. You know, to say that Horemheb only reigned 4 years But Seti the First is combined with that reign to make 14 years. And yet we find wine dockets with a 13th year. You know, there's some strangeness here in his calculations.
By his father, Seti, when his father reached his 8th year on the throne. And Ramesses at that time was very young. He was probably no more than about 16 or 17 years old. Now, the new chronology proposes that Horemheb or Haremheb had a sole rule of 4 years, 1 month, just as Manetho says. But then he had a co-regent who was this king called Ramesses I, who starts the 19th dynasty, who only reigned for 1 year and 4 months. And then he was succeeded by his son.
Okay, that's not how co-regencies work. You know, the previous king does not have his reign subtracted because he has a co-regency. Co-regencies don't work that way in Egypt. They never have worked that way. The previous king always gets benefit of his full reign. Okay? So that's just not the way that co-regencies work in Egypt. So the idea that Horemheb reigned, 4 years independently, but, Seti I came along and had a 10-year co-regency with Horemheb. That's garbage. That's absolute garbage. Because you also have Ramses I in there too. Ramses I reigned before Seti I. Are we saying here that Horemheb reigned 4 years, and then Ramses I reigned 1 or 2 years, and then Seti I reigned, his 11 years? Yeah, this makes no sense. This is complete bullocks.
Seti. So he was then a contemporary of Horemheb during 6 years, the last 6 years of Horemheb's reign, or Haremheb's reign. So you see what's happening. You have the end of the 18th dynasty petering out with Horemheb, and you have a secondary line of 19th dynasty kings who are contemporary with Horemheb until he dies in his 13th year, which is, what am I saying, 13th year? His 13th year, and then you have Seti putting his son Ramesses on the throne after Horemheb has died. So in other words, Horemheb does have a...
David Rohl has changed his chronology, several times over the years. And each time it gets stranger and stranger and stranger. And this is just sort of more evidence that he can't hold it together. It's just getting so strange at this point that he has to resort to this ad hoc reasoning just to try to get things to sort of be semi-coherent, and it really isn't.
13-year reign, but he only has a 4 year, 1 month sole reign on his own before these other kings come along. So Ramesses then becomes the co-regent of his father Seti from year 8 onwards. Seti then dies in his year 11, and Ramesses then becomes sole ruler of Egypt. And
there is no evidence of a co-regency between Seti I and Ramses II. There's no evidence for it at all. Again, this is just an accommodation for the new chronology. Where's the evidence?
That is just 2 years before the Battle of Kadesh, the famous Battle of Kadesh, which is where David comes into the picture. Because all this time, King David has been on the throne while all this has been going on in Egypt. So I'll come back out of that and try and take the share off. So I know that's very complicated, but essentially what you've got to understand is that the 18th dynasty, the Amarna period dynasty that's coming to a close, petering out, Tutankhamun died. He's succeeded by a couple of generals who take over for a short period of time. Horemheb or Haremheb is the last of those. At the same time, the 19th dynasty starts, and they are ruling together with Ramesses I and Seti I, and eventually Ramesses
I was a general. He rules after Horemheb, who was also a general. Horemheb wasn't the last general. Ramses I was. And Ramses I was a grandfather. He had an instant dynasty. No, this is complete nonsense.
Second, so when Horemheb dies, Ramesses II is the only king on the throne. He's the big ruler now. And within 2 years, when he's, he's quite young now, he's like, he's only probably 20, 18, 19, 20. He has to fight this battle of Kadesh up in the north on the Orontes River in Syria against the Hittites. And this is where David comes in, and he actually plays a part. His army plays a part in the saving of Ramesses II from certain death, because the Hittites were winning that battle. And then a group of soldiers suddenly appear on the horizon from the west and attack the Hittites from behind when they've surrounded Ramesses in his camp, and they slaughter the Hittites. Now, these people are actually mentioned in the Egyptian text as saving Ramesses, coming to his rescue. And they're called in the Egyptian text Nearin.
Okay. This is funny. This is really funny. Because the people from the west who actually save Ramses II happens to be the army of Seth. Okay? The Egyptian army was divided into 4 divisions. And he takes those 4 divisions to Kadesh. And Ramses essentially falls for a Hittite trap. And it's the army of Seth that comes in and saves him. Okay? Now, the Naharain don't come in to save Ramses. The Egyptian texts don't say that. What do the Egyptian texts say about the Naharain? We do have records of this. Why don't we actually read the records and see what it says that the Naharain did at the Battle of Kadesh? Okay. So, Ramses II says, quote, "His face is fierce amidst the masses of the ruler of Hatti and the rulers of Naharina." That's the Naharain. "He prevails over them. They being made into heaps of dead bodies." End quote. That's from Kitchen's Ramesside Inscriptions, Volume 2, page 14. Ramses II also says, quote, "The good God, great of victories, sovereign, powerful in strength, subduing the 9 bows, who smites Hatti, who tramples down Koda, who makes great overthrow in Naharain, who slays the rebellious flatlands and hill countries, wallowing in their blood like water, non-existent." End quote. Kitchen's Ramesside Inscriptions, Volume 2, page 153. Who were the Naharain? They were the allies of the Hittites. And they are the enemy. David Rohl may be confused about this, but Ramses II wasn't. The Naharaim are the enemy. They aren't allies coming into the rescue. It's his own army that comes into the rescue. And not a minute too late to save Ramses.
They're called the Nearin. They're coming along in their chariots, in their armor, and they're slaughtering the Hittites who are about to kill Ramesses. Now, Ramesses must have been eternally grateful for this happening. It must have been an ally, because these Nearin come from Canaan. It actually says they're from Canaan.
Yes, the Naharain are from Canaan. They're considered to be the resident rulers of Canaan. Okay, no question about that. But they're not David's army. This is just silliness. This is just, the new chronology messing with history. And this is the sort of messing you have to do to make this all work. You have to turn history on its head. You have to make enemies in the text allies. You have to say black is white. And this is just craziness.
So some king somewhere in Canaan has sent his army of Nearin, which basically means young, youthful soldiers, commandos. They're the youthful members of the army, the cadets, if you like. And they've come along and they've saved Ramesses Bacon at the...
And then he turns around and kills them all. Turns them into big heaps of bodies. Yep, That's what you want to do to all your allies. Mm-hmm. Yeah, tough sell.
Battle of Kadesh. Now, that means that there must have been a very important ally in the time of Seti and Ramesses who signed a treaty with the Egyptians and therefore came to fight on their side against the Hittites during this famous battle. And that person, that king, is...
Yeah, that's just sterile conjecture again. Again, if all you're doing is empty conjecture, you can conjecture anything you want. You know, this is fantasy.
King David. And the reason why it's King David is because David's special troops were called Nearim. That's the Hebrew version of Nearim, the Egyptian version. Okay, and they're mentioned in several places. If you read your biblical text about King David, you'll constantly see mentions of these Nearim. Okay, and it's them that are sent to fight with Ramesses and come to his rescue at the last minute. So there's been a peace treaty between the Israelite king, David, and King Seti, which is...
There's no proof of any of this. This is all empty speculation.
It's been sealed by this agreement that they will come to each other's defense. This gives David the power to go and build his empire because he hasn't got the enmity of the Egyptians to confront him in the south. He's got free reign to go and sort out everybody else in the region because he's an ally of Egypt and therefore he's looking after Egyptian territory on their behalf as well. So they are both...
Or, more likely, Egypt was dealing with the late Bronze Age collapse, the collapse of the 21st dynasty, and Egypt was really in no state where it could assert its hegemonic extensions, allowing the Israelites to expand their kingdom, just like the Philistines expanded theirs.
Benefiting from it. David makes his great military empire, and Egypt maintains the empire that failed under the Philistines, because the Philistines were defeated by Saul. They were no good at it. And so...
that's not quite true. The Philistines were never completely defeated by Saul. You know, this is one of those things that you know, the reach of, say, the Israelite kingdom never made it quite to the coastal plain. So the Philistines were never completely defeated. Now, there was an agricultural war, and what we have with Saul and King David was that fighting of the agricultural war in the Shephelah. But the Philistines were never driven out from the coastal cities. They kept those coastal cities almost through the entire history of the biblical record. You know, it's only when later on during the Roman period that the Philistines actually have to are sort of defeated and annexed. But they hold on to those coastal cities for a long, long time, and they're never defeated by the Israelites. So we have to understand that the Israelite holdings went from, say, the Arabah in the south, through the Judean foothills and through the Shephelah and into the northern regions, but it left that coastal plain untouched.
Egypt chooses a strong leader in Jerusalem called David to go and do the work for them and protect the region and protect it from the Hittites.
Yeah, the whole idea that David was a vassal of the Egyptian king, again, where's the evidence for this? There's no evidence for this. This is just, again, conjecture.
Yeah, and
and conjecture isn't evidence.
To kind of, first off, just to let the audience know, you know, a lot of times we'll have questions from people who are more skeptical of these stories. They'll ask, how is it possible that Joshua, the Judges, and David could have this operation with Egypt? And of course, the answer for the Joshua and Judges period is that they don't leave the highlands. But then you get to David, and they do leave the highlands.
Exactly correct. All the battles of the 18th dynasty are on the Via Maris. They go up to Syria and to Mitanni on the Euphrates, and they don't go anywhere near the hill country. They go along the coastal plain, or they go by sea to Byblos. They don't actually head into... There are only two kings in the entire Egyptian history who went into the hill country. One of them was Ramesses II, and the other was Shoshenq I.
Actually, Merneptah also goes into the hill country. We do find one of his scarabs at Gezer. So we do know that Merneptah also went into the highlands, into the Judean foothills. Okay, so it's not wasn't that common for Egyptians. I mean, most of the time Egyptians followed the road of Horus, and traveled via the coastal plain up into to reach Syria, and then they went through the Esdraelon Valley into to access Syria. But, however, we do find that some kings also returned and did venture into the Judean foothills. Necho II, when he lays siege, when he comes back from his beleaguered, his unfortunate war with Nebuchadnezzar, Necho II actually comes down to the Judean foothills to extract tribute from Jerusalem. So that's not quite true.
Of the 22nd dynasty, both of whom now are equated with Shishak. New chronology is Ramesses II, and in the conventional chronology, it's Shoshenq I. So they're the only two kings that ever went into the hill country of Israel. So you would not expect contact between the Egyptians and the Israelites in the Judges period. The only time you would start to see it happen is the United Monarchy period, when you have David and Solomon. And then, of course, you have the marriage alliance between Pharaoh.
Or you get it a lot in Dynasty 19, before the Israelites arrive.
And Solomon, who marries Pharaoh's daughter. That should be a big enough signal to tell you that they're working together.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when we consider that Egypt was quite fond of what we might call a form of vassalage that's actually quite common in the modern day, where you do leave them independent, but they kind of work for you in a way. Like the United States is quite infamous, unfortunately, for doing that sort of thing. But it's something that I think that, for the audience to understand, and not to, get into modern politics or anything, but it's just to help you guys understand, right? This idea of proxies, where you don't actually conquer them, but they kind of work for you, right?
Yeah, they would be called allies in the terms of the treaties that they've signed at this time. And they're usually sealed by a marriage. That's how they're normally completed. So, for instance, when the Hittites eventually find the time to have peace with Egypt in Ramesses II's year 21, way after the Battle of Kadesh, it's sealed by a marriage. So the Hittite king sends his daughter to marry Ramesses II. That's the way it works. And that is exactly what's happening in the time of Solomon. David is saying, okay, we've got a treaty. You Seti I, promise that your son and successor will actually give his first child in marriage to my son, Solomon. And that's what's going on here. So Seti arranges, even before Ramesses is Pharaoh, is king, and even before he's had any children, there's a promise that the eldest daughter of Ramesses, the son of Seti, will marry King Solomon, who is the son who becomes the successor of David.
Proof?
Now, briefly, I do want to bring up, while we're on David,
at the end. Okay, so bearing that in mind, and remember that people for a long time now have equated Psalm 104 of David with Akhenaten's hymn to the sun, or hymn to the Aten. They are, the ideas in both are exactly the same. They're not exactly word for word, but the phraseology, the references in there are the same. One of those two kings has borrowed that from the other. Now, David wrote a lot of psalms, had.
Yep, and the hymn to the Aten did get around. It wasn't confined to Amarna. The Aten cult did survive at least into the reign of Seti I. So that gives it more than enough time for the Amarna hymns to be brought to, say, Avaris, to become part of the religious milieu that we find there. And they would have invariably been spread across the ancient Near East, just like, say, Tales of Gilgamesh went the other direction. So, this is nothing unique in the scribal sort of methods of the ancient Near East.
A lot of psalms written for singing purposes. It may well be that I talked to you about this earlier on, that solar Yahwism that is in the royal family of Israel is borrowed from a Semitic line of kings in Egypt who now suddenly worship one God.
Yeah, that's really speculative. And the fact is, though, that Atonism wasn't monotheistic. It was pantheistic. So even there, you've got to make a lot of presuppositions about the Amarna texts to draw that conclusion. And I don't think it follows, honestly.
And that God is the light of the sun. And so all the other gods are rejected by Akhenaten and his family, and they worship one God. And this is where you get this thing about what did Akhenaten affect?
Yeah, just because something is a monolatry doesn't mean it's a monotheism. Monolatry is the worship of one God. Monotheism says there is one God. Akhenaten was not a monotheist. He recognized that many gods existed as manifestations of the Aten. That's pantheism. That's not monotheism.
Moses thinking theologically, or did Moses affect Akhenaten theologically? What we can say now is that both David and Akhenaten were Yah worshippers. But
okay, listen carefully to what he's done. What he's done is he's presented a hypothetical fallacy. So, Akhenaten may have been from a line of Semitic. Akhenaten may have been a Yahweh worshiper. So therefore, Akhenaten and David were Yahweh worshippers. That's a hypothetical fallacy that doesn't follow logically. You need to show evidence of the premises before you go to the conclusion. You can't just keep saying, if something, if something, if something, therefore. That's the definition of the hypothetical fallacy. And David Rohl does this a lot. This is one of his favorites. In fact, many of his most sort of compelling arguments are actually just sort of veiled hypothetical fallacies. If this is the case, then this is the case. It's a form of circular reasoning. It's a form of circular reasoning. He's begging the question. But he's doing it in a way that he's presenting a hypothetical first, and then drawing that conclusion from the hypothetical as if the hypothetical were evidence.
And the name Aten that we find in the text is actually probably written or pronounced Yati, which means the father. And that is...
No, it's not. Nope. Aten is not pronounced Yatin. It's I-T-N. It's Iten, if you really want to get specific about it. But there's no Y at the beginning. You'd have to put a double I there for that to be Yatin. So no, it's not, doesn't come from the father. It's a completely different phonetic construction. You know, it's not related to the word father in any way. So this is etymological nonsense. He's using the transliteration to try to make an etymological link, and that's just garbage.
The same reference to that we get of the father in the Bible all the way through. That Aten Yati is probably the same thing as Yah.
And of course that...
No, it's not. Because there's no Y in front of Yah, Aten. It's just... This is crazy talk. You know, he's just sort of now pulling stuff out of thin air to get to where he wants to go, which is to appeal to his audience. So this is, wow, this is bad.
That is a huge thing that could easily be its own episode, but it is something that we, of course, had to at least briefly get to here because,
it's in the book. It'll be in volume 2 of Legendary Kings eventually when I get it done.
Absolutely. And by the way, again, just so you guys are aware, make sure that you are in the lineup for getting Legendary Kings, because that is going to be something you will not want to miss. So then jumping to Solomon, we have, of course, David. He passes. He seems to pass. Well, actually, one last question about David before we leave. And then, do the Egyptians or anyone else mention some of the major events of his reign, particularly like Absalom's rebellion, something that might affect them?
No, we don't have anything specifically, but then again, you wouldn't expect it from the Egyptians. I mean, the Egyptians never wrote about other kings. I mean, they never tell the stories of any other kings. They have peace treaties with them, but they treat, it's not part of Egyptian history. They don't refer to other rulers. And that's throughout Egyptian history. You would not expect that to be the case. However, there is a strange thing in this, and that is that Ramesses II, in his year 8, claims to have defeated and plundered the city of Shiloh. Now, originally, when I wrote A Test of Time many, many years ago now, back in the 1990s, I thought that was a reference to Jerusalem, quite obviously, because Yerushalem just mean, it just means the city of Shiloh. So I originally thought that maybe that was Shishak plundering the Temple of Solomon and taking the treasures away from the palace and taking them back to Egypt. So what you have in the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. On the other hand, now, I mean, that was the thing that attracted me at that time. But before that, I had done some work on the idea that Ramesses II actually, as Shishak, plundered the Temple of Solomon late in his reign, not early in his reign, around year 54 or 55. The reason for that is that the Talmud tells us that the king who gave Solomon his daughter in marriage was called Shishak. Now, that's what the Talmud says. Now, based on that, it means that Shishak must have reigned for 36 years from the time when he gave his daughter to Solomon. And that was probably in Solomon's 10th year, because that was the marriage when the marriage took place. And then year 5 of Rehoboam, when Shishak comes along and plunders the Temple of Solomon, that's 36 years. So there's no king of Egypt other than Ramesses II that reigned that long in this period.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a couple problems here. Okay, first of all, Ramesses II's last campaign was in his 18th year. The idea that he campaigned in his 54th year is just that's crazy. He's an old man in his 54th regnal year. He's in his 80s. So, he's not going to be campaigning in his 54th regnal year. The other problem with this is taking a legend out of the Talmud and giving it the weight of real history. Any legend you find in the Talmud is going to be deeply, deeply problematic. A lot of this stuff was committed really, really late, as late as 500 AD to paper. So, that's just, you can't take anything out of the Talmud as gospel truth. It's just, it's so removed from the ancient events that it's not credible. It's not evidence. So, wow, this is... If he's got to go to the Talmud for this kind of stuff, his theory's in trouble.
So it seems that Ramesses II is Shishak. His short form of his name, or what we call the hypochoristicon, was Shisha. That's what the...
No, it wasn't. His hypochoristicon was not Shisha. It was Sesisu. Okay? Has 3 S's in it. Sesisu. Okay? This is an error that Rohl repeatedly mentions, because it's the only way he can get it to work with Shishak. So he keeps intentionally misreading the nickname of Ramesses II so that he can get that conversion of Shishu to get Shishak. So this is baloney. It's complete baloney. It's another Rohl fantasy where he twists the data to get exactly the reading he wants.
Many people called him, especially in Canaan, they called him Shishak. Places are named after him, called Shishak. So it's very likely that Shishak is in fact the short form of Ramesses' name, which is originally was Riamashisha. That's how it's pronounced, and the short form was just the ending, Shishak. So just like in the Bible, you have King Pul, who is Tiglath-Pileser III in the Assyrian kings. We have these abbreviations in the Bible, so maybe Shishak is a short form of Ramesses.
Yeah, the problem with that maybe is that we have a counterfactual, which is the name Ramses does appear as a place name in the Torah, where it's Ramesses. You know, it uses summix. It doesn't use sheens. You know, again, here's another hypothetical fallacy. You know, if this is the nickname, if his name is Sesisu, then maybe his nickname was Shishu. Well, you know, and then he goes, well, therefore, Shishu is Shishak and Ramses II is Shishak. No, that doesn't work because that's a hypothetical fallacy. You have to have the evidence to show that his name, first of all, that his nickname was Sisu, which is not right. It's not correct. You know, that's not his nickname. Then you have to show that you get the conversion from the summix to the sheens, which you can't do because Hebrew doesn't convert it in that way. And then you have to then are battling the fact that the Bible does attest the name of Ramses. And it in no way, I mean, if it takes his nickname, which is Sesisu, and turns it into Shishu, well, we should also then expect Ramses to be Ramshish. But it isn't. Again, the counterfactuals destroy this argument. But he never addresses the counterfactuals. You know, he's always chasing after these hypothetical arguments.
Proper name, Riamashisha. And therefore, he's the only one at this time that could have been the father-in-law of Solomon and also the plunder of the Temple of Solomon in year 5 Rehoboam. He's the
Again, depends upon this all depends upon his new chronology. Without it, it all crumbles to dust.
Only king that has a long enough reign for that to happen.
And then, so with that, with the him showing up then that earlier time in the 8th year, is it possible that that could be him actually maybe even helping David, or something along those lines?
I think it's the opposite way around. I think David helped Ramesses. I think Ramesses was fairly young, remember. He's come to the throne in his father's reign. His father died a few years later. Poor old Ramesses is very young. He's not even 20 years old. And he has to fight the Hittites. And he needs the help of David to defeat the Hittites. And of course, that whole sort of like signing of a treaty and the promissory that Ramesses' eldest daughter would marry Solomon, the son of David, is signed and sealed before Solomon becomes king. And that child is not even born until the time when, in year 8 of Seti, Ramesses gets his first 2 queens, Nefertari and Iset Nofret. Iset Nofret is actually the queen who gives him his first daughter. Now, what's fascinating about this daughter is she's the only Egyptian princess that we know of in the entire history of Egypt with a Semitic name.
That's pretty interesting, actually.
She's called Bintanat or Bintanath, okay,
Yeah,
which means the daughter of Anath. Now, Anath or Anat was the goddess who is probably the same as Baal out of Byblos, and she is equated with Hathor and Isis. She's also a warrior goddess, and she was one of the 2 gods of Egypt who Ramesses claims to have saved him at the Battle of Kadesh.
Yeah, Anat would also probably have been worshipped at Varus as well. And again, this is the sort of the place where Ramses grew up. So the idea that one of his daughters would have had a Semitic name is, you know, not that unexpected. You know, again, it's a theophoric name, but it's not necessarily a Semitic name. So,
So Amun and Anat. And if you imagine the treaty has already been signed and the promise is that your first eldest daughter is going to marry a Semitic king, you would give her a Semitic name.
Yeah, and a Semitic name that...
Yeah, all of this is based upon the speculation that Ramses, in his 8th year, signed a treaty with David. Wait a minute. Aren't the Egyptians supposed to have hegemony over the entire Levant? You know, this is crazy talk. You know, Egypt is when Ramses is doing his campaigns into Levant, he's trying to re-establish Egyptian control over the region and push out the Hittites. He's not signing peace treaties of that nature. He's not signing these as equals. He's signing vassal treaties, if anything, suzerain treaties. Those are the only treaties that Egyptians sign while on campaign. You know, this idea that he's signing a treaty as an equal with King David is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
That is actually directly related to your battle where they helped you. That's quite the connection there.
It is. And so we actually might know the name of Solomon's Egyptian queen. And what's fascinating about it is that Bint Anat disappears from Egypt. She's not mentioned from her birth when she's born for a few years. Then she disappears and she comes back in inscriptions in the 3rd decade of Ramesses II's reign. Between, there's no mention of her at all. Now,
yeah, we don't actually have a lot of documentary evidence for most of the children of Ramses II. You know, very, very little remains of most of the children of Ramses. He had 120 children. You know, we don't actually have full documentation of the whereabouts of most of the daughters and sons of the king of Ramses, sons and daughters of King Ramses II. This is just an absence of evidence argument. You know, and again, it's the sort of argumentation I expect from David Rohl.
In terms of that, if she went to Israel to marry Solomon, and then the Queen of Sheba turns up a decade or so later.
Oh, of course, the Queen of Sheba too. Yeah, sure. Why don't we throw her in the mix as well? We've got an absence of evidence here. We can throw anything in here. You know? Why don't we throw in Barney the dinosaur as well? You know? That's the problem with absence of evidence, saying that, well, we don't have any evidence that she... So we're going to make up this whole biography about her. History doesn't work that way.
We'll use the Force. That's not how the Force works.
Causes a schism between the Egyptian princess and her husband, the Israelite king. She would go home to daddy. She would say...
She would she? How do you know?
I'm having enough of this. You're not messing around with these other queens, these other females. I'm not having it. I'm going back to my father. And she goes back to Egypt, and she turns up there, and she becomes the great royal wife of Ramesses II after Nefertari has died.
And that actually leads us to another interesting question, which will move us on now to Solomon, which is, and perhaps maybe I should even ask that question a little later, but we now have Solomon. He starts to begin his reign. 40 years is potentially, I know some people say it could actually be just a reference to like the way we'll say, oh, it was like 1,000 days or something like that, just a long period of time. Who knows, right? But let's assume it's roughly 40 years just for argument's sake.
Yeah.
And he would probably start his reign. I think he dies around the age of 70, so sometime around 30 some odd years old.
He was 12 years old when he was. That's what the Bible says, and that's what the Talmud says. He was 12 years old when he became king.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, excuse me. I was thinking of David. David dies at the age of 70.
Oh, right, yes, of course.
Yes.
Well, in fact, we're pretty sure that because David anointed Solomon as his successor before he died, that probably Solomon's reign began in the 38th year of David, not the 40th.
which of course would, ooh, excuse me, would change the chronologies a little bit, which I think there's been quite a bit of chronologists who have done the overlapping there with the biblical chronology. It only changes it by a couple of years.
Yeah, it doesn't make a huge difference, not compared to what we're trying to do here, which is 300.
It actually makes almost no difference at all, because there's nothing dependent upon the dating of either Solomon or David in this matter. So it doesn't actually change anything.
100 years. I mean, it's,
yeah, right.
It's vastly different.
So first things first, does the death of David transition to Solomon, or even before that, right? Beginning of the transition to Solomon before David quite dies.
Yeah.
Do we see any reaction to that from Egypt? Like, are they worried at all that their allied king is dying?
Well, no, because now the commitment of the treaty comes in. And don't forget, these treaties were very serious business in the ancient world. You never broke a treaty. The Hittites never fought against the Egyptians. The Mitanni never fought against the Egyptians after the treaties. The treaties were very solemn documents. So if you've had a treaty with King David and you have promised your eldest daughter, or Seti's son has promised that his eldest daughter would be the one who marries and becomes the queen of Israel, then that has to be kept. So this was probably quite a joyous occasion where, it's when the temple is actually consecrated, the marriage takes place on the same day. So, this is.
Yeah, I don't get how, the consecration of the temple means that Solomon married his Egyptian bride on that same day. I don't get that. I don't see how the two relate. That seems like a red herring to me.
In, I think, the 10th regnal year, in 961 BC, is when the temple is consecrated and Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter on the same day. And I won't be at all surprised if Ramesses II was there in attendance.
Yeah, and in fact,
Ramses II leaving his throne to attend the wedding of Solomon and his daughter in Jerusalem. Okay, now I've pretty much heard it all.
In fact, that might even, in the eyes of the rest of the world, add some legitimacy to Solomon's project, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And he's now got the bargain of the century because he's now a great merchant prince. He's the guy at the fulcrum of all the trade between Mesopotamia and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Arabia, all the spice trade. He's sitting in Jerusalem controlling all of that. He's selling horses for right, left, and center. He's got an he's now developed a chariot army. David started it, but now Solomon's got these huge chariot forces. All this is because he's the ally of Egypt. And he is therefore in a very, very strong position, not only to make huge sums of money and wealth out of it and build fantastic monuments, but also it means that he has political support from Egypt. There's no threat to Solomon while Egypt is responsible for looking after their backs.
And of course, and we do see that in the Bible, right? Solomon has, in fact, his name, right? Shlomo means peace.
Exactly. And when we do get a lack of peace in his reign, it's internal. It's a breakup internally. It's nothing to do with outside influences.
Right. And, well, actually, I'm going to save that question because that'll be probably the very last one, because there is the question of how do we get to the...
At least until the Assyrians come. The fact is that the Hittite Empire and Egypt were suffering from a breakdown of their societies. So, no, they're not going to be doing incursions into the Levant at that time because they've got bigger fish to fry.
Rehoboam point, but a few quick questions about Solomon first. So, first thing, more of a fun thing than something that would actually be super important, but does Solomon get a mention in Egypt, or potentially even like a trip, like a diplomatic trip to Egypt?
We don't have that, except there is
Hey, Solomon, you win an all-expenses-paid trip to Thebes! What is this? Is this history or the fantasy sweepstakes?
I think it's where is that now? Is it in one of the Psalms or somewhere else that we have this story about a love of the king by a woman. And it says that she never sees her husband because he's gone away to somewhere, to Egypt, I believe. So it may be that this is a reference to Pharaoh's daughter feeling abandoned by her husband. You know, kings getting together and abandoning her to her palace, which is very interesting, because at some point,
really
in that
painful.
reign, she disappears from the scene. She doesn't get mentioned anymore in Solomon's reign. And then all of a sudden we got Bathsheba and the Hittite incident where the Hittite king soldier is killed, so that Bathsheba can be married to no, that's David, isn't it? What am I saying? That's David. So that's David ending up with Solomon as the son of Bathsheba, and then you have Solomon then having the Queen of Sheba coming along, and then we're having that affair. Then he has lots of other queens and lots of other.
Unbelievable. The idea that Solomon had an affair with the Queen of Sheba is... There's no biblical warrant for that. That's just a myth that just keeps getting perpetuated. There's no historical evidence for this. You know, and I can't believe he even mentioned that. You know, there's no warrant for it. It's baseless myth. Unbelievable. And this guy is purported to be a historian? Good grief.
The mistresses, and the Egyptian queen obviously felt neglected. So at some point or other, she disappears from the reign, just as she reappears in Ramesses II's reign. So it looks like she went home. But in spite of that, in the time that they were married...
Oh yeah, the Queen of Sheba was the cause of the breakup between Solomon and Ramses II's daughter. This isn't history, this is storytelling.
The time that she was in Jerusalem, it tells us, the Bible tells us, that Solomon built her a palace. But he didn't build it inside the city of Jerusalem, because that would have been like... anti-Yahwist, because obviously she worshipped a lot of Egyptian gods and goddesses. So she was shoved what was up above the city of David, up from the city of David, the reference is. So her palace was to the north and higher up than the city of David. And we found evidence of an Egyptian palace and tomb north of the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, looking down on the city of David and the Temple of Solomon. So that tomb had 3 Egyptian sarcophagi in it, not Israelite burials, but Egyptian burials for mummified people. Now, we don't know who the 3 were, but the chances are this is for Pharaoh's daughter, and either...
We do find in Israel a number of Egyptian burials. So, you know, there's not just the one found near the Damascus Gate. We do find them throughout Israel, and part of the reason is because... Egypt did have garrisons that were spread out across the Levant. So it's not at all uncommon to find Egyptian burials. They're not mummified, however. They're buried in these sort of cartonnage clay coffins. I mean, you can tell that they're Egyptian burials. They're not Semitic burials in any stretch of the imagination. But they're also notoriously difficult to date, too, unless you've got pottery remains there, too. So, it wouldn't surprise me to find an Egyptian burial near Jerusalem.
2 offspring or 2 servants. We're not sure which. Maybe she didn't produce any children for Solomon. Maybe she only produced then in which case Solomon would look for a male heir from somebody else. Well, of course, eventually Rehoboam was the one who succeeded in a male. And then, and it looks like these Egyptian sarcophagi in this burial chamber were never used. In which case, what happened was Pharaoh's daughter skedaddled back to Egypt to her father, brought her children with him, and then Rehoboam.
Okay, I think there's a more likely alternative for that, because the fact is that Egyptian burials in the Levant were basically, as I said, cartonnage. They weren't your typical wood burial caskets. or stone sarcophagi like you find in Egypt. What they typically were was they were essentially molded around the dead person. So they were essentially cartonnage is a kind of paper mache that's made out of papyrus, or they would use clay, and they would basically build the coffin around the dead person. So you don't exactly find abandoned burials, Egyptian burials in Canaan. But what you do sometimes find is these clay coffins that have been smashed open to be robbed of their grave goods. So that's why you wouldn't find, say, the bones and the bodies in there, because they were removed. The jewelry and the amulets were stolen, and the bones were just tossed away. And what remained are the clay fragments of the coffins. So that's probably what happened in these burials. And it's all too typical of Egyptian burials in Canaan.
Became the king of Israel, or the king of Judah rather, because the kingdom split at that point. And then, of course, you have this whole.
Oh, and I should add the fact that you don't find bodies with those coffins. Again, it's an absence of evidence argument. He's making up a story as to what happened to the princess who didn't use a unnamed Egyptian burial. Yeah, he's just sort of filling the blanks here with fiction.
Business of the reparations that Pharaoh comes along and seizes back Gaza, which is the town which has been given as a dowry to Solomon from Pharaoh's daughter. In other words, Ramesses has given Gaza to the Israelites, to the Israelite king. But when his daughter is, basically ignored by the king, he wants it back again. He demands it back again, and he gets it back through his son Meneptah, who goes along and calls himself the binder of Gaza, because he recovers the city for Egypt. He rebinds it back to Egypt, and it's no longer in the possession of the Judean kings, the Judahite kings. So Rehoboam does not rule in Gaza. Only Solomon did.
I thought you said that that only Ramses II and Shoshenq I went into the Judean foothills. What's Meneptah doing there?
So as soon as Solomon dies, Gaza returns to Egypt.
And this is another one where it's like, it's kind of a fun thing, but it could potentially be a gleam. We have, of course, the Song of Solomon, which is something between Solomon and one of his brides.
Now, that's the one I was referring to. It wasn't the Psalms. Yes, it's that. It's the Song of Solomon. You read that carefully, and it talks about the girl wandering the streets, not being able to find her husband, and it also refers to him being away, being somewhere else. And that, I think, is Pharaoh's daughter writing that.
Again, where's the evidence?
And which leads us to, I think, an interesting intrigue, which is we do, of course, after that, have the Queen of Sheba show up.
Yeah.
It doesn't explicitly say that they were together, but later Jewish tradition.
It doesn't say it at all. And it actually doesn't even come to us from Jewish tradition. It comes from the Kebra Nagast. So that's a 13th century AD Aksumite text. So it's it's not exactly a reliable witness.
Tradition is very clear that they were.
Yes, exactly.
And Ethiopian tradition even has the King Menelik tracing his descendancy.
Exactly. Now, what do you think? How do you think that would have gone down with Pharaoh's daughter?
How do you think that would have gone down with the King of Sheba? The Queen of Sheba was just a diplomatic representative of the King of Sheba. Yeah, she goes and visits Solomon and comes back pregnant. Yeah, how's that going to go over down in Saba? I'll tell you how that's going to go over. And it's not going to end well for the unfaithful queen, I'll tell you that.
Right, and that was actually going to be my next question. Is that maybe like the beginning of this? Because Queen of Sheba is obviously not a small figure, right? She's a regent of a region that's probably enemies of Egypt.
Exactly. Well, yes. I mean, it's possible down in the Yemen area, but she was certainly very powerful because she controlled the spice trade, and that was the deal that Solomon.
Her husband controlled the spice trade. She was a diplomat. She would have been under surveillance at all times. There would have been no hanky-panky between her and Solomon. There was too much on the line here for that to take place. Sorry. Yeah, this is just a silly myth that just keeps, raising its ugly head.
Made with her to bring the spices into the Middle East from Arabia. So again, that's part of his wealth mechanism. So yes, I mean, almost certainly the peace treaty between David and Seti I, continuing into Ramesses II's reign of
what peace treaty? I know of no peace treaty.
Solomon was broken by the fact that Solomon was unfaithful to the Egyptian princess. That would have been an ultimate insult to the Pharaoh, Ramesses.
I hear a lot of would haves, ifs, may haves. I don't see a lot of evidence. I'd like a little more evidence.
Who was no weakling. And so he demanded his daughter back. And then at the end of Solomon's reign, he went for Jerusalem and took all the treasures away and said, this is reparation for what you did.
Right. And I think that's such an important thing for us to point out because, the immediate question people have, and
again, you're putting words into Ramses' mouth. There's no evidence that he took the treasures of the Jerusalem temple as reparations for what Solomon did to his daughter. This is just crazy. This is just absolutely screwball crazy.
It happens with the old chronology too, but it's a little bit, seemingly at least, worse with the new chronology because people ask, they're like, what is it that makes not only the self-same line, but the self-same person actually break treaty with these people? And I think that Queen of Sheba incident provides a very solid answer. Well, Solomon himself has broken the treaty.
Yeah, and of course...
Wait a minute. Okay, so what we're supposed to believe here is that Solomon broke the treaty with the Egyptians by having sex with another woman, the Queen of Sheba. Okay? And because he was unfaithful to the princess of Egypt, that brings down the wrath of Ramses II. That makes no sense. And the reason why this makes no sense is because kings in the ancient Near East had dozens, potentially hundreds of treaty wives. Ramses II had hundreds of treaty wives. Solomon had 1,000 treaty wives. Every king in the ancient Near East had treaty wives. And those kings had sex with each and every one of those treaty wives. One does not break a treaty in the ancient Near East by having sex with another woman. It just this is nonsense. This is so out in left field you can't get a radar fix on it. This is just the way politics worked in the ancient Near East. Kings accumulated lots of wives as they signed treaties. And they had sex and children with all of them. This is how a king proved he was great, by the number of treaties he signed and the number of wives he had. Ramses had this. Solomon had this. Shoshenq had this. It's just the way kings in the ancient Near East were. So that the idea that this was cause for Ramses' II daughter to go crying home is just crazy. Oh, it's so unrealistic. It's not even funny.
Solomon, and towards the end of his reign, was not at all popular either, because obviously things had gone pretty bad at the end, and there was no war with Egypt at this point, not until Rehoboam comes to the throne. But don't forget that Rehoboam's enemy, Jeroboam, he goes to Egypt and is looked after by Pharaoh Shishak in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, it's Egypt which sends Jeroboam back after Solomon's death and says, you be king. You are our ally. We've looked after you. You now go take over Israel as king. And he takes over the northern tribes. And it's only Rehoboam who takes the southern tribes, the two southern tribes. And that's why Judah is so weak at this time. Israel is the powerful state because it's backed by Egypt.
And kind of give you...
Well, that's not really what happened. Shishak sheltered Jeroboam because he was an annoyance to Solomon. Solomon wanted Jeroboam killed. So he returned to Egypt, or Jeroboam went to Egypt to seek sanctuary, and the king of Egypt granted it. And when Solomon was dead, Jeroboam was free to go back. Now, Jeroboam did not know that he was returning to become king. He became king when he returned. But there was no pre-existing agreement between Jeroboam and Shishak. You know, Jeroboam might have been grateful. Then again, he might not have been. We've also seen that a lot of kings who were put on the throne were not exactly grateful to their benefactor overlords. You know, the kings of Judah were infamous for this. So, you know, I don't see that there was actually any pre-existing agreement here between Jeroboam and Shishak. And furthermore, we know that Shishak was the perfidious sort. He was inherently untrustworthy. You know, he tried to interfere with his neighbor's politics. You know, he would have backstabbed Jeroboam at a moment's notice, and Jeroboam knew this. And he ultimately did. So, okay.
Yeah, a lot of modern historians prefer not to use personalities in history as driving history. I'm the opposite. I believe it's all about people. It's about kings. It's about their relationships with other kings. It's about marriage.
Yeah, but then again, you're not really a historian. You're a raconteur, storyteller. Historians don't work the way you work.
Between them, and things can go awry if that personal contact breaks down. So if Ramesses II, the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history, gets slighted by Solomon.
Ramses II as the most powerful king in Egyptian history, that's really contested. He was the most successful builder in Egyptian history, but he wasn't necessarily the most powerful king in Egyptian history. I think that honor goes to Tutmosis III. You know, the guy who forged the Egyptian hegemony in the first place. So, it's really, really clear that, you know, and there's been some work done on this recently that really showed that, you know, Ramses II didn't have as much power as, you know, we perceive from his monuments. Now, his monuments make him seem very powerful, and that's the point of those monuments, is to show that he's powerful to the gods. But there's a difference between the perception that a king presents to divinity and the reality on the ground. And, you know, there's been, as I said, some good work done on this that shows that, you know, Ramses had, you know, limitations as far as his power goes. So,
this young king who married his daughter, and his daughter is in tears coming back to Egypt, he is not going to be happy about.
More of the crying daughter coming back to Egypt. It's an age-old story.
That. And he says, right, what are we going to do? We're going to stop this Solomonic line. We're going to get Jeroboam down into Egypt. We're going to train him so that he loves Egypt and works with Egypt. We're going to send him back when Solomon dies, and he's going to become king of Israel. Unfortunately, the kingdom splits in two. He takes the northern tribes. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, takes the southern tribes, and he's not liked by the northerners at all.
Mm-hmm. And of course, not by Egypt either, right? Because they end up showing back up and ransacking the place a little bit.
Exactly. So you see how it fits so much better this way than having some king called Siamon in the Third Intermediate period, 21st dynasty, who nobody's heard of. We have no text about him campaigning. We have nothing that says he's the father-in-law of Solomon. We have no connections there whatsoever. But here
you have no connections either. What you have is pure supposition. You don't have any connections. This is just not how it works. And frankly, Siamon is a perfectly reasonable candidate to be the father-in-law of Solomon. Because the one thing Egyptians almost never did was traded daughters. They would accept daughters from foreign kings, but they never sent them out. This is one of the things that we find in the Amarna letters, the complaints of where some of the great empires are saying, we sent you a treaty daughter, and you did not send your daughter in return. Egyptians were notorious for these treaties being one-way streets. And all of a sudden, we find a daughter from Egypt being sent to Solomon? You're going to have to explain that with extraordinary circumstances. Now, Ramses II, as a powerful king, would be under no compulsion at all to send his daughter to Solomon. He could just take what he wants. But if it's Siamon, where the kingdom is weak and failing, and yes, he doesn't have a lot of inscriptions. He's got no inscriptions. He's got very few little architecture. Because the end of Dynasty 21 is that sort of end of the Semendes line, where the whole sort of kingdom is crumbling. Egypt is in a bad state at the end of Dynasty 21. It's having to cope with Libyan raiders. It rules Upper Egypt in name only. The priests of Thebes really rule Upper Egypt. The 21st dynasty is about to fall, and it's desperate for allies. It needs support. And the king is so desperate that he's willing to give away his daughters to get those treaties. This is a better explanation for the change in what's typical Egyptian behavior. So that makes a lot more sense than Ramses II, at the height of his power, sending daughters. Just putting it out there.
In the 19th dynasty, we have a beautiful, rich collection of connections between Egypt and Israel.
You haven't shown any connections. Again, you've just shown ifs. Ifs are not connections. You've shown stories that you've pulled out of a evidence vacuum. You've seen a place where there's an absence of evidence, and you pull out a fiction, and you call that a connection. It's not the same.
This time. And it goes also to the fantastic structures that are built in Megiddo and Hatzor and Gaza, all in the time of Solomon with his wealth. We have fantastic late Bronze Age ruins that are Solomonic. Whereas if you put them in the Iron Age 2A...
Late Bronze ruins that are Solomonic? Are you kidding me? Solomonic is all Iron Age 1. It's all Iron Age. No, this is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
Or the Iron Age 1B, which wherever you want to put him, we haven't got those monuments for this fantastic builder king.
Yeah, and I think too, I want to briefly note, because it's, it is interesting. We have there are lots of questions when you deal with old chronology. that are very difficult for people to try and get over. And it does seem like a lot of those questions really are answered by new chronology. Like, for example, Solomon's wealth is very puzzling to people. How could this seemingly small king be so wealthy? Well, if he's the primary trade empire that is bordering his ally in immensely powerful Egypt at the time of the richest king probably that Egypt ever had, well, that explains everything, right? And in fact, it fits together quite nicely.
It basically...
Oh, there's a much easier explanation for the wealth of Solomon. Much easier explanation for the wealth of Solomon. He controlled the Judean foothills, and he controlled the Esdrilian Valley. You couldn't get in or out of Egypt or to Syria without going through his territory. And you go through his territory, you get taxed. It's called taxation extortion. Okay? You give him a bit of the wealth, and he promises not to burn your caravans to the ground. You know, this is how taxation extortion works. Okay? This is how Solomon accumulated his wealth. Is by controlling all the corridors that passed through the Levant. You control all the corridors, you can tax as you wish. Egypt was in no position to contest that, and the Neo-Hittite kingdoms above were also not in any position to go against him. So, that's really easy to explain the wealth of Solomon, and it does not require having a new chronology alliance with Ramses II. Just not necessary.
It comes down to a very simple picture you have to get into your head. Is Solomonic, does Solomon fit and David fit into the Bronze Age where you have these great empires, the Greek empires of Mycenaeans?
No, David and Solomon do not fit into the Bronze Age. Sorry.
Hittites, well, mentioned in the Bible, you know, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, all these great empires, and you have Israel, the great empire, fits into the late Bronze Age beautifully. Shove it into the Iron Age where most people put it.
Yeah, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is Iron Age. You know, Assyria has its ascendancy in the Iron Age. Yeah, Israel is just a better fit for the Iron Age. You know, even when it talks about the Book of Kings, you know, in the Book of Kings, it talks about the kings of the Hittites. Well, that's the Neo-Hittite Confederacy. That's an Iron Age confederacy. So, indeed, Israel is a much better fit for the Iron Age following, you know, at the time of King David and Saul moving forward.
Okay, and you don't have any of that anymore. It's all gone. So David and Solomon are Bronze Age kings, wealthy, heroic age kings. And that's where they
baloney.
Logically fit. They do not fit in the Iron Age, which is much more impoverished by comparison.
The Iron Age wasn't impoverished. It had a shift in wealth. Okay? It had a shift in wealth. So, I don't think it's fair to say that the Iron Age was impoverished. It just had a different kind of wealth and a different distribution of wealth. So, I think that's kind of silly. It's a silly argument to make.
And, of course, has a much more aggressive Egypt, right? At least towards Israel. Egypt is aggressive in the Ramesside period, but not towards the Judean highlands, at least not till the end, right?
No, I mean, essentially, I mean, both Seti and Ramesses II rely on David and Solomon to maintain their northern empire, their strength there, while they tackle more distant foes. So they're looking after their home territory through David and Solomon. When we get to the later period, after the assassination of Ramesses III, and we fall into this decay in Egyptian terms, which we call the Third Intermediate period, the only king that comes out there that stands out is Shoshenq I, who does campaign in the hill country, but he doesn't campaign in Judah. He campaigns in the north.
Yeah, but what you're not telling him is your chronology places Shoshenq I at the same time as contemporary to Ramses II, at least according to your 2007 new chronology. Or have you updated it yet again?
northern kingdom of Israel. He doesn't touch Judah at all. He bypasses it and he goes north. And what he's actually doing is defending the northern kingdom against the Aramean invasions coming from Damascus. Now, the raiding parties which come down in the time of the divided monarchy kings of the northern kingdom. He's coming to defend his ally, and he's not touching Judah in the south because Judah is not being attacked by the Arameans from the north.
And then one thing I would want to look at here as we start to kind of get towards the end, right? So we're seeing the really immense evidence that, in fact, it's interesting. There's a lot of really solid pieces of evidence in the whole new chronology. In my personal opinion, the two strongest are when we start talking about the evidence of slaves in Egypt during the period between Joseph and Moses, and then this right here, Solomon and Ramses.
And of course the Alemanna letters, which we have actually had letters from King Saul and from Ishbal in the Amarna archives. I mean, there are three major areas now. But the interesting thing is that when I published Exodus Myth or History with the Patterns of Evidence movie Exodus, people said, oh, well, this all looks pretty good. Yeah, you can get away with all this, but it doesn't work for the rest of the history, does it? It doesn't work for the Judges period. It doesn't work for the United Monarchy. It doesn't work for the divided monarchy.
It doesn't work for Assyria.
Sure it does. They just don't seem to understand it because it's all here.
Doesn't work for the Hittites.
What we talked about today shows you how beautifully it continues from the time of Joseph
the Babylonians
all the
or the
way
Elamites
to the fall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Everywhere along that line, history of Egypt and Israel matches up beautifully. It's not just the Exodus material. It's not just the sojourn. It's not just the conquest. It's
a beautiful theory destroyed by brute facts. So sad.
Everything.
Absolutely. And so then the last thing we'd want to ask is then, so Solomon, of course, he has his moment, he passes. He's not popular with the Israelites when he does, as you already mentioned, right? He's been quite oppressive and has had some pretty vicious taxes as well. Do we have, other than, of course, the reference to potentially a military campaign, excuse me, do the Egyptians speak of what's going on their border and even the attempts to quell the Judans, potentially training Jeroboam?
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that Ramses II was one of the longest reigning Egyptian pharaohs, 66 plus years. And so as he gets older, he doesn't really campaign that much. So he probably sends his sons
campaign at all after
you're 18. And one of his sons, Meneptah, who succeeds him, he's actually a general in the army. And he's also the crown prince late in Ramses II's reign. So Meneptah himself had this Israel stela carved. Remember the stela with the mention of Israel in it? Israel whose seed is no more. Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. That is Meneptah referring to Ramesses and his work in actually defeating Rehoboam in Jerusalem and actually supporting the northern kingdom. That's all about that, and recovering the city of Gaza, the dowry that Ramesses gave rather to Solomon for his daughter's marriage. That's taken back into Egypt. Meneptah brings that back into the control of Egypt. It's no longer an Israelite city anymore. So there's all that going on. But you would expect towards the end of Ramesses' reign for the inscriptions to peter out, because he's had decades and decades of carving inscriptions on walls of the Battle of Kadesh, other military successes. He's not going to be doing that towards the end of his reign, where he's touching sort of 70, 80 years old. That is going to decline in that period. So that's the period when we don't hear much about what Ramesses is doing from the Egyptian side. But we know from the connection to the Bible that there is activity going on, and it's all focused on the kingdom of Israel.
And of course, that is something that I think is shocking for people to know. But yes, Ramesses did reign a very, very long time, right? He might be one of the longest reigning monarchs of all time, being 66 years reigning. That, of course, gives him time to reign throughout, starting at King David's reign, all throughout Solomon's reign, and then ending in some undisclosed time in the reign of Rehoboam.
Yeah, absolutely. He's the only king with a long enough reign to cover that whole period, without a doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know some people have argued for Thutmose III, but that just does not work for numerous reasons.
And remember what I said earlier, that his full title not in Egypto-speak, what the Egyptologists pronounce, but the way it was heard by the Hittites is Washmu Aria Shatatnaria Ria Mashisha Miyamana. That's how he was pronounced, actually how it was heard by the Hittites. So his name Ramesses, which is a Greek form of his name, is Ria Mashisha, and he's referred to it.
Okay, the reason why you have those sheens in the Hittite language is because the Hittites, even though they wrote their diplomatic correspondence in Akkadian, converted all their names into Hittite. And Hittite does not have a sibilant S. You cannot say snake in Hittite. All S's in Hittite are sheens. So the summix in Ramses the name, which in Egyptian is Usur Ma'are Setep in Re Ramesu Mariamun. Okay? Takes that Ramesu and turns the sibilants into sheens, because the Hittite language has to do this. And the reason we know that the Hittites did this is because we also have diplomatic correspondence from the Hittites, original letters that were written in Hittite, where they did the same sort of conversions. Okay, so even though they later turned those letters into Akkadian, they translated those letters into Akkadian, the original drafts of that diplomatic correspondence was written in Hittite. And the Hittites always converted the S's, the sibilant S's in Ramses II's name into sheens. Okay? That's why we see it in Hittite. But just because it happens in Hittite doesn't mean it happens in Hebrew. Because Hebrew uses different rules of transliteration. We have to remember that Hittite is an Indo-European language. Hebrew is a Semitic language. Doing that comparison with Hittite and then saying that the same conversion happened in Hebrew is as relevant as, Japanese. It's just not, it's not relevant. Different rules, different language, different rules.
Papyri from this period as Shishak. So Shisha is Shishak.
Yeah, there's no evidence of this being the nickname for Ramses II. Sorry.
The name Shishak is obviously different to Shisha by one letter, which is the kof at the end, Shishak at the end. That's the difference between the two. But in the late Bronze Age, coming all the way down to the 10th century, the sign for Wav was a stem with a loop on the top, like a lollipop or a popsicle. And then by the time of the 9th century, when we get to the Isbet Sata Ostracan, that sign has become the letter Kof. So in the records of King Solomon, the name would have been written Shisha. The Wav would have been a vowel marker for the letter A. So the name was written Shisha, but by the time it got to Josiah's time, when they saw that, they thought that sign represented Kof. So they changed the name to Shishak.
Okay, no, they did not mistake the final vav for a final kof. That's just silliness. Here's again the whole problem with this trying to make the nickname of Ramses II fit Shishak is you have to go through all these intellectual hurdles to get there. You have to assume that Sesisu becomes Sisu. Okay, that's hurdle 1. Hurdle 2. you have to assume that Sesisu becomes Shishu. Again, we've already talked about this, that this is not a natural linguistic transformation from Egyptian to Hebrew. The final, cognitive leap he has to make here is that the final consonant in Paleo Hebrew, which is a vav, which basically looks like a Y character, somehow becomes confused as the cough later on, and frankly, that just never happens. The two letters are very distinct, and they aren't confused. So he's making a supposition here that, his three cognitive leaps here to try to get the nickname of Ramses to come out as Shishak is really, really complicated. This is not just something that's intuitive or obvious. If anything, the intuitive choice would be to say that Shishak is Shishank. Yes, okay. Shishank has an N in it that Shishak doesn't. Well, it's a lot more intuitive and a lot simpler to say that the N simply dropped out than to transform three letters in the name. Just on a pure mathematical basis of which requires less transformation. What's the simpler hypothesis? Occam's razor would suggest that Shishak is actually Shishank, not Ramses II.
The two signs changed. First of all, as a loop on a stem wav, and then later as a loop on a stem kof.
And just to briefly give you guys kind of a modern example of that, if you were to read older English, the J for like Jesus, for example, will sometimes be replaced with an I, because you don't actually pronounce the J with a J, you pronounce it with a Y. So it's Jesus. Yeah. Over time, that of course becomes a J, and we start calling him Jesus. But it's the same thing as kind of you're talking about now, right? The letters start to change their actual sound.
The paleography changes, the style of the letters change, but it's a very strange fluke that one letter, which was Wav, becomes a Kof, and that has caused all the problems of Shishak being Shoshenq I and dating the Egyptian history to 925 BC based on the biblical text, and then that biblical text proving that the Exodus never happened in Egyptian terms. So there you go. You see, one letter has caused all the mess up in the first place.
Absolutely. And by the way, friends, there is an in-depth discussion on that in our first interview with Dr. Rohl here. So I would certainly recommend, in fact, I'll drop that in.
Dr. Rohl. Okay. Yeah, David Rohl does not hold a doctorate. He never has. I know he loves being called Dr. Rohl, but he does not hold a doctorate. His highest degree is a master's. So he used his fame and fortune to publish his books as popular press. But Rohl has never earned a doctorate. He's Mr. Rohl, not Dr. Rohl.
The live chat for you. So that actually wraps up everything we're going to want to be talking about here today. We don't want to be taking up too much, of course, of the time here. So I want to definitely thank you for being here with us again, sir. I greatly appreciate you. You're absolutely the best guest I've had on here so far. No offense to any of the other guests. It's just, I mean...
Well, it's been a pleasure, CJ, and it always is. So anytime you want
Bootlick much?
to have another chat about something else, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that a lot, actually, because, you know, obviously it's cool to talk to people, especially being a young person like myself, talk to people you've been looking up to for quite a while. But I am serious when I say it's very rare that somebody gets to speak, I think, with scholars of your capacity. So I absolutely appreciate you.
And that's because we don't find many real scholars with that kind of capacity.
Being here today.
All right, it's been great fun.
Okay, well, that is the end of the video with CJ Cox, Synagogue, interviewing David Rohl. Wow. That was fawning. Okay. You can kind of see why I selected this video for a popcorn review. It's junk archaeology. It's junk archaeology, pure and simple. You know, we have almost all the earmarks of junk archaeology. You've got twisted facts. You've got arguing from an absence of evidence. You've got the hypothetical fallacy. You've got question begging. Wow, you got so much speculation you can fill a stadium. And all of this speculation hinges on his new chronology. Without that new chronology, everything he says is complete rubbish. And the problem with the new chronology is it's always changing. It's always changing. It never stays the same. You know, there's been times when he's changed it within the same book. It's not internally consistent. It's self-contradictory. It's constantly broken. He expects others to fix it. You know, so you just can't take his views seriously. Without a consistent, internally consistent chronology, you cannot build internally consistent history. And if you're not going to rely on evidence, then you're really not a historian. You're the writer of fiction. You're a storyteller. You're a raconteur. You're a guy in a costume who pretends to be an Egyptologist. And that's what we have here with David Rohl. Is a guy in a costume who pretends to be a historian. He's not doing the exercise of history. He's building a fan base. And that's always sort of been his modus operandi. And we see it here too. He's appealing to a certain section of the audience that would pretty much, you know, swallow anything he says. But you can also see it really doesn't take much to poke holes in it either. Which is why David Rohl has no credibility within the academic community. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this popcorn review. I appreciate you sticking it out to the end, because this was long. And I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.